South Park has been banned by more countries than almost any other animated show. It's been scrubbed from the internet, pulled from broadcast, and condemned by sitting government ministers. But the list isn't only authoritarian regimes. One country removed it after just 6 episodes, and another did it because of a bad vacation. In this video, we look at every country that banned South Park. China, the ban that erased everything at once. For years before South Park ever made an episode about it, the pattern was there for anyone paying attention. Somewhere in the mid-2010s, something shifted inside the American film industry's relationship with China, and the shift was not sudden and it was not subtle. Studios began altering their movies before those movies left the editing room, removing content that Chinese government censors had indicated they found objectionable, not because a regulator had formally demanded it, but because the production teams had learned through experience which kinds of content were likely to cause problems, and began cutting those things out themselves. This is what the film industry calls anticipatory self-censorship, and by the late 2010s it had become so routine that it barely registered as news when specific examples surfaced. The examples were not trivial. The trailer for Top Gun: Maverick, released in 2019, showed Tom Cruise wearing a bomber jacket with the Taiwanese and Japanese flags on the sleeve, replaced by abstract-colored patches. The actual flags quietly removed because they appeared in combination with Tencent's investment in the production and the knowledge that even a small national symbol could create problems at the box office in Beijing. The 2013 film World War Z was re-edited for its Chinese release to remove dialogue suggesting China was the origin of the zombie plague, a change the studio made specifically to avoid the regulatory friction that comes with depicting the country in a way its government considers unfavorable. Skyfall arrived in Chinese theaters with 2 separate scenes removed, including one in which a hitman murders a Chinese security guard and another that referenced British intelligence operatives being tortured by Chinese authorities. Red Dawn, a 2012 remake that was originally filmed with Chinese troops as the invading force, had its digital files altered in post-production to replace every Chinese flag and insignia with North Korean equivalents, a process that cost millions of dollars and was done entirely to avoid the anticipated response from Chinese officials and media. These were not secret decisions. The trades and entertainment press reported on them. Academics wrote papers about the broader dynamic. Non-profit organizations compiled research documenting the scale of self-censorship and the categories of content most commonly being removed. Tibetan characters were being whitewashed out of scripts entirely. References to Hong Kong's political situation were disappearing from dialogue. LGBTQ characters and relationships were being cut or reduced in films that were intended for release in the Chinese market. The pattern was documented, discussed in panels and articles, and ultimately treated as an accepted cost of doing business in one of the most valuable film markets on Earth. Parker and Stone were watching all of this. A show that had spent more than 2 decades naming things directly and then building jokes around the act of naming them was looking at an industry-wide behavior that was almost perfectly designed for that approach. Hollywood was doing something specific. It was doing it openly, and it had developed a fairly sophisticated vocabulary of corporate language for describing it as anything other than what it actually was. The financial logic was real enough. Chinese box office revenue was enormous, growing, and increasingly essential to the profit calculations of major studio releases. An animated short film that had started on a cable channel in 1997 and had no financial relationship with the Chinese market whatsoever was sitting at a considerable distance from that logic, which meant Parker and Stone could examine it without any personal stake in the outcome. The second episode of season 23, which aired on October 2, 2019, was built around exactly that examination. The episode is called Banned in China, and it tells its story through 2 separate storylines that run alongside each other and arrive at the same place from different directions. Both are about what people give up when they decide that access to a particular market is worth more than the principles they started with. Randy Marsh's half of the episode begins with an idea. Randy runs Tegrity Farms, his marijuana operation, and he has spent some time doing arithmetic about the Chinese population. The numbers are large enough that even a very small percentage of that market represents more money than Randy can realistically spend. He arrives at the airport in China with his product and is arrested almost immediately. The marijuana is discovered before he gets through customs, and what begins as a business trip becomes something considerably more serious within his first hour in the country. Randy ends up in a labor camp. The camp is depicted in ways that correspond closely to documented reporting about facilities in China's Xinjiang region, where large numbers of Uyghur Muslims had been detained in conditions that multiple human rights organizations were describing in those same months as involving severe restrictions on movement, forced political indoctrination, and systematic abuse. The episode makes no attempt to soften this or to place fictional distance between its setting and the real-world facilities it was clearly referencing. Randy is shown in a facility that looks like what the reporting described. Inside the camp, Randy encounters 2 other detainees. Winnie the Pooh and his companion Piglet are imprisoned there, and their presence requires some background to fully understand. Around 2013, users on Chinese internet platforms began circulating image comparisons between the round, gentle animated bear and Chinese President President Xi Jinping. The physical resemblance some people found funny was enough for the meme to spread widely, and the Chinese government's response to the meme's spread was disproportionate in a way that turned a light internet joke into an international story. Searches connecting the two figures were censored on platforms the government controlled. In 2018, the animated film Christopher Robin, an adaptation of the Winnie the Pooh story, was denied a release in China entirely, the government offering no formal explanation that the country's film regulators were willing to state publicly. A children's bear had been effectively classified as a politically sensitive subject. The episode placed the actual cartoon bear in Randy's labor camp as a direct reference to this censorship history, and the gag arrived with a specific kind of clarity. The bear had done nothing threatening. He had simply existed in a form that someone outside the camp had found funny enough to compare to a powerful person. His imprisonment was the punchline, an illustration of what it looks like when a government treats an internet meme as a genuine threat to its stability and responds with the full weight of its regulatory apparatus. Randy, still single-mindedly focused on his business deal, regardless of where he has landed, eventually kills Winnie the Pooh in order to complete the transaction. The episode ends with Randy narrating his success in the Chinese market, while events play out around him that make his satisfaction feel hollow against the reality the episode has been depicting. The show does not editorialize about this gap. It simply places the two things next to each other and leaves them there. Stan's half of the episode operates through the entertainment industry directly. Stan and his friends form a metal band called Crimson Dawn that attracts local attention and is eventually approached by a music industry manager who explains the mechanics of how careers get built. The manager's advice centers on biographical films rather than recorded music, and Stan agrees to let his story be made into a movie. Once production begins, the censorship begins with it. Chinese government officials appear physically on the film set, watching Stan write the script in real time, erasing passages and lines as he produces them. The censors work without explanation or apology, treating the removal of content as a routine administrative function that requires no justification and allows for no appeal. At a specific moment in this process, Stan delivers a single line of dialogue that functions as the episode's most direct statement of purpose. Watching his own story being rewritten around him by officials with no creative stake in what the story is, Stan says that he now understands how Hollywood writers must feel. The line has no preamble and no follow-up. It states what the episode has been about, names the target plainly, and moves on. Mickey Mouse appears throughout Stan's storyline as a corporate enforcer. The Disney characters and Marvel figures who appear within his company's intellectual property portfolio are shown accepting the censor's requirements as a condition of doing business, not as something they are being forced to accept against their will, but as something they have made peace with in the way that people make peace with arrangements that cost them less than the alternative. Mickey's management of the whole situation is depicted as cheerful and entirely free of moral consideration, running on the pure financial logic of maintaining market access at any cost. The episode does not create a fictional analog for Disney. It uses the actual Disney character in a way that makes the critique specific, rather than general, connecting the satire directly to documented corporate practice rather than to a made-up stand-in that could be understood as referring to anyone. The episode aired on a Wednesday evening. By the following Monday, The Hollywood Reporter had documented what had happened to South Park's presence on the Chinese internet. Every episode of the show that had previously been accessible on Youku, the streaming service owned by Alibaba and one of the main legal channels through which Chinese audiences watched international content, was gone. Links that had worked the previous week returned nothing. A South Park discussion community on Baidu's Tieba platform, which had functioned as one of China's largest online discussion forums, was no longer accessible. Visitors to the forum's address were met with a message stating that the section was temporarily not open in accordance with relevant laws and regulations. Weibo, the social media platform with hundreds of millions of monthly active users, showed no mention of South Park anywhere in billions of searchable posts. The show had been present on the platform before October 20 and was entirely absent from it 5 days later. Parker and Stone released a statement the same day The Hollywood Reporter published its documentation of the erasure. The statement was written as a mock corporate apology and directly referenced the NBA, which was in its own confrontation with Chinese authorities that same week after a team executive had published a tweet expressing support for pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. The NBA's response had involved pulling scheduled broadcasts and issuing statements emphasizing its respect for Chinese audiences, the league scrambling to limit the financial damage from an executive's 15 words posted on a social media platform. Parker and Stone wrote that they too welcomed Chinese censors into their homes and into their hearts, that they too loved money more than freedom and democracy, and that Xi Jinping did not look anything like Winnie the Pooh at all. The statement concluded with a wish for a bountiful autumn harvest and the question of whether they were now in good standing with China. There was no ambiguity about whether this was a sincere apology or a performance of one. The statement was, at every level, a parody of exactly the kind of corporate language the entertainment industry had been using for years to describe its accommodation of Chinese censorship requirements. The collateral damage from the ban extended beyond the show itself and into the careers of people who had no involvement in making it. Zed, a German electronic musician with a substantial commercial profile and financial interests, publicists connected to the Chinese market announced several days after the ban that he had been permanently barred from China because he had liked a tweet from South Park's official account. His publicist confirmed the announcement. The tweet in question was a post celebrating the show's 300th episode and contained nothing that would register as politically sensitive on its own. Zed had not issued a statement about China, had not commented on the episode, and had not expressed any opinion about the controversy. He had pressed a button on a social media platform in response to a post from a television show, and that single interaction had been sufficient for Chinese authorities to add his name to whatever list governed which foreign performers were permitted to work in the country. PewDiePie, the YouTube personality with more than 100 million subscribers, was similarly erased from Chinese internet platforms after posting a video expressing support for South Park and participating in the Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh memes. He announced the ban publicly and appeared, by his own account, fairly delighted about it. Inside the American entertainment business, the ban's downstream effects were measurable in specific ways. Insiders told Bloomberg News in October 2019 that Apple, which had been considering a bid for South Park's streaming rights as it built out the content library for its Apple TV Plus service, was unlikely to make a meaningful offer because of the China ban. Apple maintained a significant portion of its manufacturing operations in China and had substantial consumer business there, creating a set of incentives that made partnering with a show that had just been fully erased from the Chinese internet a complicated proposition, regardless of the creative quality of the content. The ban had, in this specific way, affected the show's commercial value in a market that had nothing to do with China. What the Chinese government did to South Park between October 2 and October 7, 2019 was something that no external organization had ever managed to do to the show in the previous 22 years of its existence. Parent advocacy groups had applied pressure and produced temporary schedule changes. Religious institutions had organized campaigns and achieved brief omissions from rerun blocks. A corporate relationship involving a film star had apparently influenced the pulling of a single rerun from a single slot. None of those outcomes came close to what happened in those 5 days in October 2019. A government with direct control over its country's internet infrastructure removed the show from that infrastructure entirely and without negotiation, and the removal was complete in a way that no American advocacy organization had ever come near achieving. The Parents Television Council had spent decades monitoring South Park and filing complaints and issuing statements. The Chinese government spent about 5 days and made the show disappear from a country of over 1 billion people. Parker and Stone did not alter the episode, did not issue any genuine expression of regret, and did not take any steps suggesting they wish the episode had been different. The show returned the following week with a completely unrelated episode. Season 23 continued on its original schedule. Banned in China remained on the South Park Studios website for viewers outside China, was available on streaming services in every territory the Chinese government did not control, and was not pulled or modified in any way by Comedy Central or Viacom. The government that had the capacity to erase the show from the largest market in the world had no capacity to change what the show had said, and the people who made South Park appear to have understood this before they made the episode. The decision to air Banned in China was also a decision about who actually got the last word. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. China's erasure of South Park happened within days and covered everything at once, the most complete ban in the show's history. The next country to ban it took a different approach entirely, quietly replacing the show with something that looked just like it, but had all the sharp edges filed down. Section 2. Kuwait. The ban that built a replacement broadcasting. Standards in Kuwait have always operated from a set of premises that most Western regulatory frameworks do not share. The country's media oversight does not treat religious content as a category requiring careful case-by-case evaluation, weighing the satirical intent of a program against the potential offense it might cause to a specific audience. Content that mocks or demeans Islamic figures and beliefs falls into a category that Kuwaiti standards treat as simply incompatible with what can be shown, and the institutional response to programs that cross that line has historically been swift and categorical rather than deliberative. This is not a recent posture adopted in response to any particular controversy. Kuwait's approach to broadcast content involving religious material has been part of the regulatory environment for decades, built into the formal architecture of how the country decides what its television channels are permitted to show. Understanding this is the starting point for understanding what happened when South Park arrived in the awareness of Kuwaiti distributors and broadcasters in the late 1990s. The show had been on American cable television since 1997 and had spent those first years accumulating the kind of international profile that made it a recognizable property across markets well beyond its home country. Distributors were making decisions about bringing it to new territories, and those decisions required matching the show's content against the specific standards each territory applied. Kuwait's assessment of that match was not a close call. The show had made jokes about Muslims from its earliest seasons, not as a singular focus or a running fixation, but as part of a broader pattern in which every religion received the same irreverent treatment Parker and Stone applied to everything else they pointed at. Jesus appeared as a recurring character since the pilot. Moses showed up in an exaggerated form. Buddha participated in ensemble comedic situations. audience. The show's equal opportunity approach to religious satire was, for its creators, the entire point. Nobody received permanent protection from being made fun of, and the consistency of that approach was its own argument for fairness. Kuwait's regulatory framework did not weigh that argument in the way Parker and Stone would have recognized. The question was not whether the show's treatment of Islamic content was consistent with how it treated other religious traditions. Consistency across religions was not a mitigating factor inside a system whose underlying premise was that depicting Islam in a way that could be considered mocking or disrespectful was categorically prohibited, regardless of what the same program did with Christianity or Judaism or anything else. The show's general character as a program that made jokes about Muslims was sufficient to reach a conclusion. No specific episode needed to be identified, and no particular sequence needed to be isolated as the crossing of a line. South Park was the kind of show that crossed lines Kuwait had drawn, and the ban followed from that assessment without requiring a more granular analysis of what exactly had been shown and when. The South Park movie, released in 1999, also received a ban in Kuwait, and the documentation around this case adds a dimension that goes beyond the show's general treatment of religious content. The film was cited as offensive to the Muslim Brotherhood, one of the most significant Islamist political organizations in the Arab world, which maintained an institutional presence in Kuwait and carried enough political weight that its expressed objections about foreign media had practical significance rather than simply being the position of a private organization. The movie's content, across its full runtime, was already more than Kuwaiti standards would permit in almost every respect. The explicit language, the treatment of the relationship between Saddam Hussein and Satan as a romantic and sexual subplot, the satire of American moral panic. The Muslim Brotherhood dimension appears to have added a specific political layer to what was already a general content objection, broadening the basis for the ban beyond the show's standard category of religious offense. Most censorship stories connected to South Park end with the ban, or the pulled episode, or the rerun omission, and then move into the public and legal fallout from those decisions. Kuwait's story takes a different shape after the ban, because what followed was not a legal challenge or a public campaign to reverse the decision. What followed was a television show. By the year 2000, it was clear to Kuwaiti producers and broadcasters that the audience appetite for a certain kind of animated comedy built around young boys navigating social situations was real. South Park had demonstrated the appetite existed. It had also demonstrated, by getting itself banned, that no locally adapted version of that appetite was going to be satisfied by importing the original. Someone in Kuwait's television production environment made the connection and decided to fill the gap from the inside rather than leaving it empty. The result was Block 13, which began airing on Kuwait television during Ramadan in 2000. Every account of the show's origins describes it as having been built around the same structural premise as South Park: 4 boys, a neighborhood setting, comedic situations drawn from everyday social life, an episodic format that kept each installment self-contained while accumulating a consistent cast of characters across the run. The animation style carried a visible debt to what Parker and Stone had made, though Block 13 was produced for a different platform, a different audience, and a radically different set of content guidelines than the show it was drawing from. What Block 13 did not have, by design and by necessity, was any of the material that had caused South Park to be pulled from Kuwaiti television in the first place. No religious satire, no explicit language, no deaths played for dark laughs. The sharp edges that defined South Park's identity were absent entirely, replaced by humor that worked within the specific cultural and religious parameters that Kuwaiti broadcasting operated under. The decision to produce the show in Kuwaiti Arabic dialect was more significant than it might appear on the surface. Animated content available to Gulf audiences in 2000 was almost entirely imported, subtitled or dubbed into modern standard Arabic, which is the written and formal version of the language rather than the spoken dialect any particular country actually uses in daily conversation. Watching characters on screen speak the way people spoke at home, in the specific rhythmic patterns of Kuwaiti Arabic, gave Block 13 a quality of cultural familiarity that no amount of production budget or celebrity voice casting could have manufactured for an imported program. The show was not just filling the content gap South Park had left. It was filling it with something that spoke directly to the audience in the most literal possible sense, using a voice and a cadence that matched how those same viewers talked to their families over dinner. 3 seasons aired across 3 consecutive Ramadan periods. The Ramadan timing was itself a specific creative and commercial choice. Ramadan in the Gulf region is a period of intense television consumption, with families gathering in the evenings after the day's fast and watching programming together for hours. The competition for Ramadan audiences is fierce, and a show that could establish itself in that window had access to the largest shared viewing experience in the calendar year. Block 13 found its audience in those Ramadan evenings and held on to it across all 3 seasons, achieving a level of popularity that was genuinely unprecedented for locally produced Gulf animation, because locally produced Gulf animation had never existed in this form before. Block 13 was the first animated sitcom to come out of the Arab Gulf states. That milestone exists entirely because South Park was banned in Kuwait. The show's reach extended well beyond the country that produced it. Regional channels including NBC3 picked up Block 13 and carried it to audiences in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, where the humor's cultural specificity proved to be something viewers responded to rather than a barrier to comprehension. The four boys of Block 13 and the neighborhood they lived in belonged recognizably to a Gulf world that Gulf audiences could locate and identify with, and this gave the show a kind of resonance that imported animation, however popular, could not replicate. Parker and Stone had built South Park around the specific geography and social texture of a small Colorado mountain town, and that specificity was part of what made the show feel lived in rather than generic. Block 13's creators had understood this and applied the same principle to their own material, making something rooted in a specific place and a specific way of speaking, rather than something smoothed into the general register of pan-regional entertainment. 3 seasons was a substantial run for a first-of-its-kind production operating within a narrow content window, and when Block 13 ended after the 2002 Ramadan season, it left behind a small but real legacy in Gulf animation. The series had demonstrated that local production in the animated sitcom format was commercially viable, that Gulf audiences would watch 4 boys navigate social situations in their own dialect with the same enthusiasm they brought to anything else, and that the gap left by a foreign ban was large enough to support something built specifically to fill it. The show that had been banned had, indirectly, created the conditions for something new to exist. Kuwait's official position on South Park did not change after Block 13 ended. The original show had not been banned as a temporary measure, pending review, or as a response to a specific complaint that might be addressed and then reversed. The ban was categorical, grounded in the show's general character rather than in any particular episode, and that categorical foundation meant there was no obvious path to reversal. South Park remained off Kuwaiti television regardless of what happened with Block 13 or how the show developed in later seasons. The arrival of the internet and streaming services gradually changed what any television-era content restriction actually meant in practice for individual viewers, but the official framework did not accommodate those changes by softening the ban's formal status. The South Park fandom documentation of Kuwaiti censorship notes with mild understatement that the show used to be banned in Kuwait for poking fun at Islam, and that the ban led to the creation of a similar but family-friendly show called Block 13. The phrase family-friendly is doing considerable work in that summary, capturing in 2 words the entire distance between what South Park was and what Block 13 had to be in order to exist in the space the ban had opened. The family-friendly version of a South Park-shaped idea was, in a sense, the most accurate possible description of what Block 13 actually was. The same structural concept, applied in a context where every element that made the original what it was had been removed, leaving only the outline. Censorship campaigns against South Park across the show's history have produced a wide range of outcomes, most of them centered on episodes being pulled, reruns being skipped, streaming deals being structured to exclude specific content. Almost none of them produced anything new. The Bloody Mary controversy produced elevated viewership in New Zealand. The Trapped in the Closet situation produced a legal dispute and a creative reckoning. The Chinese ban produced a mock apology and a collateral effect on a German musician's touring schedule. Kuwait's ban produced a television show that had never existed before, aired it during the holiest month of the Islamic calendar, broadcast it across multiple Gulf states, and established a first in the history of regional animation production. The show being banned had more creative consequence inside Kuwait than the banned show ever could have had on its own. Block 13 is no longer in production and has not been revived. South Park has never aired in Kuwait through any official channel. The 2 shows exist now in historical documentation rather than in any active relationship with each other, and most people who know about one have never heard of the other. The 4 boys from a small Colorado mountain town who inspired the 4 boys of Block 13 are almost certainly unaware that the work they were doing in the late 1990s produced a milestone in Gulf television animation. The distance between a show being banned somewhere and a band producing something worth remembering on its own terms is not a distance most censorship stories ever travel. Kuwait is the exception. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kuwait's ban produced an unintended replacement that became a milestone in Gulf animation history. The next country on this list banned a single episode through a very different kind of institution, one that spent a decade applying pressure before the episode it hated finally appeared on a local screen to an audience 6 times larger than anyone had predicted. Section 3. Australia. 10 years of successful pressure. Australian broadcast regulation operates under a framework that gives religious and community organizations formal standing to raise objections about content before it reaches audiences, and those objections carry institutional weight in ways that are somewhat more direct than the equivalent mechanisms in the United States. The Australian Communications and Media Authority, which governs what can be shown on the country's television channels, operates alongside a system of community standards that broadcasters are expected to take seriously when making scheduling decisions. A formal petition from a religious body is not simply a protest letter that a network can file and ignore. It enters a space where the broadcaster's response to it becomes part of how that broadcaster's relationship with regulatory expectations is understood, and where the decision to air something over organized religious objection carries a different kind of institutional cost than it might carry in a country where broadcast broadcast regulation and religious community standards are more cleanly separated. The episode that arrived in this regulatory environment in December 2005 was one of the most deliberately provocative things South Park had produced by that point in its run. Bloody Mary aired in the United States on December 7, 2005, and its content required almost no amplification from outside critics to make clear what kind of reaction it was likely to produce from Catholic organizations anywhere it was scheduled to broadcast. The episode centers on two narrative threads running alongside each other. Randy Marsh, after a drunk driving incident, is ordered into an Alcoholics Anonymous-style recovery program and becomes entirely absorbed in the program's framework of powerlessness, using it as a reason to keep drinking rather than to stop. Running alongside Randy's story is the episode's central satirical image. A statue of the Virgin Mary in a neighboring town begins bleeding from a specific part of its body in a way the episode specifies and then dwells on across several scenes. The bleeding attracts pilgrims, news coverage, and eventually Pope Benedict XVI himself, who arrives to make an official determination about whether the event constitutes a miracle. The Pope's conclusion, and the specific language in which he delivers it, is the episode's most deliberately offensive moment, combining a sacred figure, a bodily function, and a theological pronouncement in a single exchange that was designed to be impossible to describe neutrally. Timing was not incidental to the episode's impact. December 7th is the evening before the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a Catholic observance specifically related to the Virgin Mary, and one of the more significant dates in the Catholic liturgical calendar. Whether Parker and Stone chose this date deliberately, or whether it was simply where the episode landed in the production schedule, is something neither creator addressed in detail. The date was specific enough to be meaningful to Catholic audiences and institutions who noticed it, and it was noticed. The Catholic League in the United States noticed it within hours, and issued a statement describing the episode as a deliberate and calculated attack on a sacred figure. The League's president called for a public apology from Viacom, demanded that the episode be permanently retired from any future format including DVD releases, and pointed out that a sitting Viacom board member was a practicing Catholic who had personal standing to intervene in what his company was putting on screen. That board member, Joseph Califano Jr., subsequently released his own statement describing the episode as appalling and disgusting, and the president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops sent a formal letter to Viacom's chief executive expressing the same sentiment. The American response generated considerable coverage and produced some real institutional consequences, including Comedy Central omitting the episode from a year-end rerun block in late December 2005. But in the United States, the episode survived the campaign against it, returned to the broadcast rotation, and has remained available on streaming platforms continuously since the controversy settled. The American story of Bloody Mary is one where organized religious pressure failed to achieve the permanent retirement it was seeking, despite the involvement of a Viacom board member and the head of the National Catholic Bishops' Conference. Australia told a different story over the same years, and the difference is instructive about what determines whether a censorship campaign succeeds or fails. SBS, the Special Broadcasting Service, is one of Australia's public broadcasters, funded in part by the federal government and operating under a mandate to serve multicultural and multilingual Australian audiences. Its programming decisions carry a dimension of public accountability that a purely commercial network might handle differently, and the Catholic Church's intervention in the Bloody Mary situation arrived in that specific institutional context. The Melbourne Catholic Church petitioned SBS not to air the episode before the broadcast was scheduled. SBS received the petition, considered it, and agreed not to screen the episode. That decision, made before the episode had reached a single Australian viewer, meant that the decade-long gap in the episode's availability in Australia began not with a public controversy and a reaction, but with a quiet institutional accommodation made before any reaction had occurred. There was no Australian audience that saw the episode and expressed outrage. There was no broadcast that generated complaints to the regulatory authority. There was a petition from a religious organization, a network that chose to honor it, and an episode that simply did not appear on any Australian screen. The mechanism of the ban was, in this sense, remarkably clean. It did not require public pressure to be sustained over time, because the initial decision removed the episode from the schedule before any of the dynamics that usually sustain or erode censorship pressure had a chance to engage. Comedy Central's decision in the United States to omit the episode from its December rerun block produced a brief period of absence, followed by the episode's return to normal circulation. Australia's decision produced something considerably more durable. For the years that followed 2005, Bloody Mary was simply not part of South Park's Australian broadcast history. Episodes from the same season aired. The show continued to have an Australian presence through its regular channels. The specific episode that had been petitioned against remained absent, not because each subsequent decision to not air it required a fresh campaign from the Catholic Church, but because the initial accommodation had established the episode's status as something that would not be shown, and that status carried forward without requiring active maintenance. 4 years after the original SBS decision, a second Australian broadcaster independently scheduled the episode and then independently pulled it under similar circumstances. Nine Network's entertainment channel Go had placed Bloody Mary in its programming lineup, and the scheduling became publicly known through the the television coverage website TV Tonight, which reported that the episode was set to air at 10:30 on a Tuesday evening. The report noted the episode's history and the controversy that had surrounded it, and within a short period of the report appearing, Nine Network confirmed that the episode would not air as scheduled and would be replaced by a different South Park episode. A network spokesperson confirmed the schedule change, but declined to provide any further explanation. The replacement episode, which aired in Bloody Mary's slot, was one that had no connection to the Virgin Mary storyline and no particular history of controversy. The Go Channel incident is worth sitting with for what it reveals about how the episode's status had calcified in Australian broadcasting by 2010. SBS's 2006 decision had been a specific response to a specific petition from a specific organization. Nine Network's 2010 decision appears to have been made without any documented petition or formal complaint triggering it, simply in response to the act of a television coverage website noting that the episode was scheduled. The awareness that the episode was controversial had become sufficient to prompt removal without requiring the full machinery of organized religious objection to engage. The censorship had, in a sense, internalized itself. The episode's history was enough of a deterrent that a network could decide, based solely on the coverage of its own programming decision, that airing it was more trouble than it was worth. Australia's relationship with the episode stood in direct contrast to what was happening in New Zealand during the same years. In New Zealand, the Catholic bishops' campaign against Bloody Mary before its C4 broadcast had generated a public controversy that the network converted into viewership, airing the episode earlier than planned to capitalize on the attention the boycott had created and drawing an audience more than 6 times the show's normal New Zealand viewership on the night. The boycott produced the opposite of what it had been organized to achieve. In Australia, the pressure produced exactly what it was organized to achieve, and did so with considerably less public drama, because the initial decision to not air the episode meant that the Streisand effect that amplified the New Zealand situation never had the opportunity to engage. An episode that cannot be scheduled cannot be turned into an event by the attention its prohibition generates. The 10-year gap finally ended in 2016, when the episode aired on SBS2, a subsidiary channel of the same broadcaster that had declined to show it in 2006. A trade publication reported the broadcast with a tone of mild surprise, noting that it had aired to little fanfare or any rage whatsoever. The audience that watched Bloody Mary on SBS2 in 2016 did not generate regulatory complaints at a level that triggered any formal response. The episode that had been considered too controversial for Australian television for a decade aired, was watched, and the world did not change in any particular direction as a result. The Broadcasting Standards Authority of New Zealand had reached a similar conclusion after its own review. The content did not rise to the level of denigration that broadcasting standards were designed to prevent. Showing disrespect for a religious tradition was not automatically equivalent to the kind of vicious attack that would warrant regulatory action. What the Australian story reveals about the mechanics of successful censorship is something that the more famous and more dramatic South Park controversies tend to obscure. The campaigns that generated the most coverage, the Scientology situation, the Muhammad episodes, the Chinese internet erasure, all of them involved escalating public drama that made the censorship visible and often worked against the interests of the people seeking to suppress the content. The Australian situation worked in the opposite direction, quietly and durably, because the initial decision was made before any public drama began, and the episode's absence never became a cause that audiences rallied around. Most Australians who wanted to watch South Park were watching it every week. The single absent episode was simply not there, and for most viewers, the absence of one episode from a catalog of hundreds was not something that demanded explanation or protest. Episodes 200 and 201 were also eventually banned in Australia, following the Revolution Muslim threats in 2010, extending the category of South Park episodes that Australian broadcasters had decided not to show. These later bans arrived in a very different context from the Bloody Mary situation, driven by safety considerations rather than by religious community pressure, but the outcome for Australian audiences was the same. Certain episodes of the show existed in official unavailability, present in the broader catalog, but absent from any officially sanctioned Australian viewing option. Bloody Mary remains available on Paramount Plus for Australian subscribers today. The decade during which it could not appear on any Australian television screen ended without the episode being altered, without any permanent retirement being achieved, and without any formal regulatory ruling that the content had violated any standard. A decade of successful censorship concluded with the episode exactly as Parker and Stone had made it, available through a different distribution channel to an audience that received it, as the trade press had noted, without any particular fanfare. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Australia's 10-year ban worked quietly because the initial decision was made before any controversy had room to build. The next country on this list made its decision in the opposite way, banning the entire show all at once based on a general judgment about its character, months before an episode aired that would have given it every specific reason it needed. Section 4. India, the ban that came just in time. India's approach to regulating what can be shown on television is formalized in a document called the Program Code, issued under the Cable Television Network's rules of 1994. The code is specific enough in its language to give broadcasters a clear picture of what is and is not permissible, and broad enough in its reach to give the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting considerable latitude when applying it. Among the categories of content the code explicitly prohibits are programs that offend against good taste or decency, programs that attack religions or communities, and programs that carry visuals or words contemptuous of religious groups. The prohibitions are stated plainly and without the kind of case-by-case qualifying language that might encourage a broadcaster to argue that a specific piece of content falls within an acceptable range. A program that the ministry determines violates the code can be removed from cable service. The mechanism for making that determination sits inside the ministry itself rather than in an independent regulatory body, which means the speed and the scope of enforcement are subject to the ministry's own institutional priorities. South Park had been available in India through VH1 India for several years before 2010. The show had an audience there, operating in the same space it occupied in most international markets, where it had found distribution, a cable channel product targeted at adult viewers, available to the portion of the population with access to the relevant cable package. VH1 India's channel head at the time, Furzad Palia, was the person who ultimately had to explain publicly what had happened and why. By the time the ban was formally in place, the show had been on the air in the United States for 13 seasons. Parker and Stone had built something with considerable cultural weight behind it, enough that its arrival in international markets carried automatic recognition from a certain kind of viewer and automatic controversy from a certain kind of watchdog organization. The Ministry of Information and Broadcasting reviewed South Park at some point in 2010. The review is the kind of institutional process that leaves behind very little public documentation about its specific proceedings. There is no detailed record of which episodes were examined, which sequences were identified as problematic, or how long the review process took before a conclusion was reached. What is documented is the outcome. The ministry found the show too vulgar to continue airing under the program code, and the ban followed from that finding. Furzad Palia confirmed the ban and its basis publicly, attributing it to the vulgarity determination rather than to any specific episode or any organized campaign from an outside group. The show had been reviewed against the code's standards. The review had produced a judgment, and the judgment had produced a ban. Vulgarity as a regulatory category is worth examining carefully in this context, because it is a broader and more subjective standard than most of the specific grounds on which South Park was banned in other countries. Kuwait's ban was rooted in the show's treatment of Islamic content. Australia's Bloody Mary situation turned on the specific satirical treatment of a sacred Catholic image. China's erasure was a direct response to a specific episode about a specific country. India's ban was different in character from all of these. It was not about a specific episode, a specific religious community's objection, or a specific satirical target. The ministry's determination was that the show as a whole, reviewed against a code that prohibited content offending good taste and decency, did not meet the standard required for continued broadcast. The ban was categorical rather than targeted, applying to the entire show rather than to any particular episode or sequence. What makes this categorical judgment so striking when viewed against the show's actual history in 2010 is the timing. South Park's 200th episode, the milestone installment that brought back virtually every significant celebrity and religious figure the show had ever depicted across 13 seasons, aired in the United States on April 14, 2010. The follow-up, the 201st episode, aired a week later. Together, these two episodes contained some of the most specifically offensive religious content in the show's entire run. Buddha snorting a line of cocaine was among the images the episodes included, placed directly alongside the depictions of Muhammad that had triggered the Revolution Muslim threats and produced the network's subsequent censorship of Kyle's closing speech. Indian news outlets that covered the ban at the time were direct about the timing. The coincidence of India banning South Park in the same general period as these two episodes aired was reported without any suggestion that the two events were connected. The Ministry of Information and Broadcasting had been conducting its review on its own timeline, operating from a general assessment of the show's content against the program code standards, and the conclusion of that review happened to arrive in the same calendar period when the show was producing content in the United States that would have given the ministry every specific religious justification it could have wanted for the ban it was about to issue. The vulgarity determination, reached on general grounds, preceded the specific offense that would have made the specific grounds obvious. Buddha's status in India requires some context for understanding why those episodes would have been particularly significant had the ban not already been in place. Buddhism originated in the Indian subcontinent, and while practicing Buddhists make up a relatively small percentage of India's population, the figure of the Buddha carries cultural and historical significance that extends well beyond that specific religious community. The country's relationship with Buddhist heritage is woven into how modern India presents its own historical identity, and the reverence attached to the figure is not confined to the strictly observant. A cartoon depicting the Buddha snorting cocaine would have landed in a very different cultural context in India than it landed in most of the Western countries where South Park aired without restriction. The country that most directly demonstrated what that landing looked like was Sri Lanka, where the ban on South Park came specifically and formally from the Ministry of Religious Affairs and Moral Uplift after the secretary of that ministry reviewed the episodes and announced the show would be banned, explicitly citing the depictions of the Buddha and Jesus Christ in unflattering parodic ways as the reason. Sri Lanka's ban was the specific grounds version of the censorship that India's general grounds ban had technically preempted. Both countries arrived at the same outcome through different mechanisms. India got there first, through a review of the show's overall vulgarity, and the specific episode that would have given the ban its clearest religious justification aired after the ban was already in place. The contrast between how these two countries handled the same essential problem illuminates something about the relationship between categorical and specific censorship and which of the two tends to produce more durable outcomes. India's ban, rooted in a general assessment of the show's character, did not require the ministry to identify a specific sequence and defend its decision to remove that specific sequence from the air. It did not create the kind of visible target that critics of censorship can point to when arguing that the suppressed content was actually harmless. A ban on a show for being too vulgar is a harder argument to contest in a public forum than a ban on a specific episode for a specific depiction, because the general case does not invite the same kind of focused counter-argument. Sri Lanka's ban on specific grounds was a cleaner narrative, more defensible to its own audience and more straightforward in its logic, but it was also more directly tied to content that Parker and Stone had made deliberately provocative and that the show's supporters could point to as evidence of equal opportunity satire being treated unfairly. Comedy Central as a channel had its own separate run-in with Indian broadcast regulation in 2014, well after the South Park ban had been in place for 4 years. The ministry suspended Comedy Central India for 6 days over content in 2 other shows, Stand Up Club and Popcorn, citing scenes that depicted women as a commodity of sex and contained obscene dialogues and vulgar words. The Delhi High Court upheld the suspension after the broadcaster challenged it, ordering the channel off air for the remaining days of the original ban and imposing a small fine alongside it. The case generated considerable commentary in India about the scope of the program code and whether its prohibitions were compatible with constitutional provisions protecting freedom of expression. Legal observers noted that the content code, as written, allowed for the prohibition of a very wide range of material based on standards of taste and decency that were not defined with the kind of precision that would make their application predictable or consistent. South Park returned to India in 2019 when the show was added to Netflix India, where it received an 18+ rating for strong language and nudity. The return happened through a channel that operated under a different regulatory framework than the cable television rules that had produced the ban 9 years earlier. Netflix's content in India during 2019 was not subject to the program code, operating instead in a space that the cable regulatory framework had not been designed to govern and that India's regulatory structure had not yet fully addressed for streaming services. The regulatory gap that exists in most countries between broadcast-era rules and the streaming environment was particularly visible in the Indian situation, where a show banned under one regulatory system became freely available through a different distribution channel that the same regulatory system had no authority over. This transition from banned to available without any formal reversal of the ban's underlying logic tells you something about what the broadcast-era bans in this video's history actually mean in the streaming age. The Indian Ministry of Broadcasting's 2010 determination that South Park was too vulgar for cable television was not reversed when Netflix brought the show to Indian subscribers. The regulatory framework that produced the determination did not change its position. The show simply became available through a mechanism the regulation was not equipped to reach, and the practical effect of the ban dissolved into the gap between two different regulatory eras without any formal resolution of the original question. What the India story adds to the broader picture of countries that banned South Park is a specific case of a ban that was more accurate than it knew. A ministry review operating from general standards of decency reached a conclusion about a show that happened to be, at that exact moment in its American broadcast history, producing the most specifically offensive religious content it had ever made. The general ban landed just ahead of the specific episode that would have made the specific case for it. South Park was pulled from Indian cable television on vulgarity grounds weeks before Buddha snorted cocaine on American screens, and the coincidence of that timing is the kind of detail that the show itself, with its long history of finding the absurd inside the institutional, would have recognized as material worth putting in an episode. We move on. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. India's ban arrived just before the episode that would have given it the sharpest possible justification. Sri Lanka saw that episode and responded with a ban of its own, one of the few cases where the show was banned not for Muhammad, but for a figure held sacred by the country doing the banning. Section 5. Sri Lanka. When the double standard argument got the show banned, Buddhism has been present on the island of Sri Lanka for more than 2,000 years. The tradition arrived in approximately 250 BCE, when Mahinda, the son of the Indian Emperor Ashoka, traveled to the island and converted its king, Devanampiya Tissa, during a meeting on a mountain plateau that Sri Lankan Buddhist accounts describe with a level of specific detail that suggests thus the encounter was treated, from very early in the tradition's island history, as a founding moment worth preserving exactly. From that meeting forward, the religion grew into something the island's identity could not be separated from. The Mahavamsa, one of the oldest continuous historical chronicles produced anywhere in the ancient world, was written by Buddhist monks in the 5th and 6th centuries and treated the preservation of Buddhism in Sri Lanka as inseparable from the preservation of the island's civilization itself. The document framed the Sinhalese people and their Buddhist faith as a single entity entrusted with a specific purpose: protecting Theravada Buddhism, the oldest surviving branch of the tradition, and transmitting it forward to future generations in its uncorrupted form. This is not ancient history in the sense of something that stopped mattering once the centuries moved past it. The Mahavamsa's framing of the Sinhalese Buddhist identity became central to the country's modern politics in ways that shaped its institutional structures, its civil conflicts, and the assumptions embedded in its legal framework. Theravada Buddhism is practiced by roughly 70% of the Sri Lankan population, and the 1978 Constitution of Sri Lanka grants Buddhism what it describes as the foremost place among the country's religions, pledging the state to protect and foster the Buddhist tradition while assuring freedom of religion to other faiths. The constitutional provision is not cosmetic. It reflects a political reality in which Buddhist institutions, Buddhist clergy, and Buddhist community organizations have carried real influence over government decisions throughout the modern era, and in which a government official perceived as insufficiently attentive to Buddhist concerns faces organized political opposition from a community with both moral authority and practical electoral weight. The civil war that had consumed Sri Lanka from 1983 to 2009 had made this dynamic more intense rather than less. The conflict between the Sinhalese majority government and the Tamil Tiger separatist organization had been framed in multiple dimensions, but the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist dimension was among the most politically potent, with organizations connected to the Buddhist clergy taking active positions on the war's conduct and resolution. By May 2009, when the war ended with the military defeat of the Tamil Tigers, Buddhist nationalism had emerged from the conflict with its political influence reinforced rather than diminished. The months that followed the war's end were a period of significant national self-examination in Sri Lanka, with questions about identity, sovereignty, and what it meant to be Sri Lankan being actively contested in ways that gave institutions like the Ministry of Religious Affairs and Moral Uplift a more visible public role than they might have had in calmer periods. South Park's 200th and 201st episodes arrived in this context in April 2010, roughly 11 months after the war had ended. The episodes themselves were already generating the most concentrated censorship controversy in the show's American history, with the Muhammad storyline having produced death threats from Revolution Muslim and the subsequent bleeping of Kyle's closing speech by a network that had concluded the safety risk was real enough to override the episode's own argument about what safety risks were being used to justify. The Muhammad material dominated every conversation about the two episodes in Western media coverage, and the Buddha cocaine scenes were treated as a secondary element even by commentators who noticed them. Something interesting within a larger and more immediately consequential. The structural relationship between the Muhammad material and the Buddha cocaine scenes is important enough to examine carefully, because it was not accidental and it was not casual. Parker and Stone had built the Buddha cocaine element into the episodes specifically as a demonstration of the double standard they were examining. The sequence was constructed with a deliberate editorial logic. The character of Joseph Smith explains to the assembled group that people become very offended when Muhammad is mocked because he is a religious figure, presenting the protection as though it flows naturally from the category of being a religious founder. The episode cuts immediately from this statement to Buddha snorting lines of cocaine in front of the assembled super best friends and several of the boys from South Park. Jesus, watching this happen, tells Buddha not to do cocaine in front of children. The edit connecting the Joseph Smith speech to the Buddha cocaine image was the entire argument in compressed form. A claim that religious figures deserve protection from offense, followed instantly by a religious figure doing something that a country of 70% Theravada Buddhists would find deeply offensive, with no buffer and no apology between the two. The joke was not targeting Buddhism or Buddha specifically. The cocaine image was chosen because it was the kind of thing that would register as deeply wrong to any audience with a reverent relationship with the figure, and because the contrast between the Joseph Smith speech's implicit claim that religious figures deserve protection and the image immediately following demonstrated, without any dialogue needed, that the protection being offered to Muhammad was not being offered consistently. Parker and Stone were using Buddha as evidence, the same way a scientist uses a control variable, to show that the treatment being applied to one religious figure was not being applied to others with the same consistency the Muhammad protection implied. The Buddha was not the target, the double standard was the target. In Sri Lanka, this distinction did not function as a defense. The Ministry of Religious Affairs and Moral Uplift, whose mandate was precisely what its name described, received information about the episode's content, and its secretary, H.M. Herath, responded in terms that addressed both the religious offense and the institutional response. His characterization of what the episodes had done framed it as defamation to every religion, rather than specifically to Buddhism, a formulation that broadened the basis for the ministry's response beyond beyond narrow national interest into something that could be presented as a principled position about how religious figures should be treated universally. He described the depiction as a crime and stated that hurting the beliefs of others in this way was something that should not be done by any person. The language was formal, institutional, and calibrated to present the ministry's action as a defense of a general principle rather than a protective response on behalf of a specific community whose political interests the ministry was aligned with. The announcement that followed the statement was comprehensive. Herath said he would ban the show and the entire television series from coming to Sri Lanka. The scope of the announced ban was as wide as it could be, not a specific episode, not the 200th and 201st installments specifically, but the complete program across its entire run. The ban was reported by the Sunday Leader, a Sri Lankan newspaper that carried the story with a headline that stated plainly what an American animated television program had depicted. The Sunday Leader's coverage treated the story as newsworthy on its own terms within the Sri Lankan context, which it was. A foreign entertainment product had depicted the country's most significant religious figure in a way that combined a hard drug with a figure whose image appears on temple walls, in household shrines, in roadside alcoves, and on the stationary fixtures of daily life across the country in a way that has no precise equivalent in how any other religion has integrated its central figure into the texture of ordinary existence. Physical media was running slightly behind the formal prohibition at the moment the ban was announced. DVDs of the show were still available for purchase in Colombo, the commercial capital of the Western Province, and the city where the country's most internationally connected consumer retail operated. The lag between a formal broadcasting ban and the removal of physical media already in distribution channels was not unusual in countries where broadcast regulation and physical media distribution operated under different oversight mechanisms. The ban had been announced and the formal prohibition was in place, but anyone who wanted to buy a DVD of a South Park season in Colombo could still do so in the immediate aftermath of the announcement, a detail that captured the transitional state of enforcement in a period when broadcast and physical distribution were being managed separately. The comparison between Sri Lanka's response and India's response, both arriving in April 2010 and both connected to the same two episodes, illuminates how differently two neighboring countries with overlapping cultural relationships to the same religious figure can reach the same general outcome through completely different institutional processes. India's Ministry of Broadcasting had been conducting a review of the show's content against its program code, a process that was already underway before the 200th episode aired. The review reached its conclusion, on general vulgarity grounds, in a period that happened to coincide with those episodes, but was not specifically triggered by them. India banned South Park before the Buddha cocaine scenes had an opportunity to become the specific justification for a specific decision. The ban arrived first, and the specific grounds that would have made it most defensible arrived afterward. Sri Lanka reversed this sequence. The Ministry of Religious Affairs and Moral Uplift responded directly to the episodes after they had aired, identifying specific content and announcing a specific response to it. The ban was specific in a way India's was not, grounded in an identifiable image from identifiable episodes rather than in a general assessment of the show's overall character. This specificity gave the ban's critics a target they could engage with. The claim that depicting Buddha snorting cocaine was defamation required only the argument that satire of religious figures, applied consistently across traditions, was a legitimate creative choice rather than a crime. Sri Lanka's ban invited that counter-argument in a way that India's categorical judgment did not. Buddha's earlier appearances in South Park were not discussed in the context of the ban's announcement, but they formed a relevant background. The Super Best Friends episode from 2001 had included Buddha as a member of a team of religious figures with superpowers, depicted in ways that were certainly not reverent, but that fell well short of the cocaine scene's specific image. The earlier episode had aired without generating any organized response from Sri Lankan authorities or Buddhist organizations, either on the island or internationally. By 2010, the Super Best Friends episode had been in existence for 9 years without producing a complaint from the institution that was now announcing a total ban on the show. The cocaine scene was doing something the earlier depictions had not done, and the difference was not merely one of degree. Giving a religious figure superpowers and placing them in a comedic adventure is a different category of depiction from showing that figure consuming drugs in front of children while being told to stop by Jesus Christ. The latter image was specific enough to trigger a response that 9 years of earlier Buddha depictions had not produced. The Ministry of Religious Affairs and Moral Uplift had a mandate that no equivalent institution in the United States or most Western countries possesses. A government ministry whose explicit purpose includes the management of moral uplift in a country whose constitution grants primacy to a specific religion is not in the same institutional position as a broadcasting regulator that applies content standards neutrally across religious traditions. Herath was not simply a bureaucrat applying a general rule about offensive content. He was the official representative of a ministry whose existence reflected the state's constitutional commitment to fostering Buddhism. His announcement of the ban was not merely a regulatory decision. It was a fulfillment of the institutional function the ministry had been created to perform. The show's streaming availability for Sri Lankan audiences followed the same pattern as other countries in this history, where broadcast-era bans collided with streaming-era distribution. The formal ban announced in April 2010 applied to broadcasting and physical distribution through officially regulated channels. The arrival of streaming services with South Park in their catalogs, accessible to Sri Lankans with subscriptions and internet connections, dissolved the practical effect of the ban without requiring any formal reconsideration of the ministry's position. The institution that had announced the ban had not changed its view of what the episodes depicted, or whether that depiction constituted an offense to religious sentiment. The technological shift that made the content accessible regardless had simply outpaced the regulatory framework within which the ban operated. South Park had made an argument with the Buddha cocaine scene about the inconsistency of protecting Muhammad from depiction, while other religious figures remained available for the same show's full satirical range. Sri Lanka's response to that argument was to confirm, from the other direction, that the protection of a revered religious figure from offensive depiction was something a government with a constitutional commitment to that tradition would act on regardless of whether the show was making a point about consistency. The argument had encountered a country where the comparison being made worked equally in both directions. If Muhammad deserved protection because his followers would find mockery of him intolerable, then Buddha deserved protection for exactly the same reason, in exactly the same proportion. Sri Lanka's ban was, in its own way, a concession to the logic of equal treatment. The show had argued for consistency. Sri Lanka applied it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sri Lanka's ban was driven by a specific image from the same episodes that caused multiple other international controversies, each country reacting to different content within the same 2 episodes for entirely different reasons. The next country banned not 2 episodes but 1, and did so because of an episode built from personal experience rather than political commentary. Section 6. Costa Rica. The ban born from a bad vacation. Trey Parker went to Costa Rica on a recommendation from Flea, the bassist for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. This is a specific and verifiable piece of the episode's production history, confirmed in the DVD commentary Parker and Stone recorded for the 3rd season when they sat down to discuss where the material had come from. Flea had been to Costa Rica and apparently found the experience worth passing along as a recommendation. Parker took the advice and made the trip with his girlfriend. What he found there was not what Flea's recommendation had prepared him for, or at least not what the ambient cultural framing around Costa Rica had been building toward since he had first started hearing about the country as a destination worth the journey. The rainforest was hot. It was dirty. It smelled in ways that the photographs had not communicated. There were snakes. Parker came back from the trip having revised his relationship with a particular strain of American environmentalism, the one that treated the preservation of rainforests as a moral imperative held by people who had never visited a rainforest and whose commitment to the cause cost them nothing beyond the price of a bumper sticker and a donation to an organization they had read about in a magazine. The DVD commentary is where Parker made the connection between his personal experience and the episode's content explicit in a way that functions as something close to a creative confession. He said, in terms that left very little interpretive room, that everything Cartman says in the episode about Costa Rica is just him saying it. The character who had been established across 2 seasons as the show's vehicle for its most extreme and least defensible positions was in this case functioning as a direct conduit for the creator's authentic feelings about a place he had actually been. The satirical distance that usually exists between Parker and Stone and the views Cartman expresses was, in the Rainforest Schmainforest episode, considerably shorter than it appeared from the outside. Cartman was saying what Parker thought. The exaggeration was in the delivery, not in the underlying sentiment. Costa Rica, in 1999, when the episode aired on April 7th of that year as the season premiere, was a country in the middle of one of the most successful national rebranding projects any small country had undertaken in the late 20th century. The rebranding was built entirely around the rainforest that Parker had found unpleasant. Tourism had overtaken bananas as the country's primary source of foreign exchange in 1993, a milestone that the country's tourism ministry and its international advocates pointed to regularly as evidence that conservation and economic development were compatible rather than opposed. The model worked like this. Instead of clearing the forest for agriculture or resource extraction, Costa Rica protected it, invested in infrastructure that allowed visitors to move through it safely, and invited the world to pay to experience it. The revenue generated by that invitation funded conservation efforts that protected more forest, which attracted more visitors, which generated more revenue. The cycle was real and it was working. By 1999, Costa Rica had placed roughly 25% of its national territory under some form of environmental protection, a proportion that was among the highest of any country in the world and that had been achieved through a combination of government policy, international conservation funding, and the economic logic that demonstrated the protected forest was generating more value intact than it would have generated cleared. International visitors had grown from around 155,000 annually in 1970 to well over 1 million by the time Parker made his trip. The revenues from those visitors had expanded from tens of millions of dollars to more than $1 billion. Costa Rica had been described in major publications and by international conservation organizations as the poster child of ecotourism, a phrase that functioned as both a compliment and a responsibility. Being the country that had proved the model worked meant that the model was attached to the country's reputation in ways that made attacks on the model feel like attacks on the country itself. This was the national context that the Rainforest Schmainforest episode arrived in when it eventually reached Latin American audiences. But before it could reach those audiences, it had to reach the American one that watched South Park on Comedy Central in April 1999. The episode's premise is built around the Getting Gay with Kids Choir, a parody of the kind of international youth performance organizations that had been touring the world since the middle of the 20th century under banners of global unity and mutual understanding. These organizations, of which Up With People was the most famous American example, operated on the premise that young people from different backgrounds performing together could demonstrate a harmony that the adult world had failed to achieve politically. They were idealistic by design, earnest in a way that left them vulnerable to exactly the kind of deflation that South Park had been applying to idealism since its first episode. Miss Stevens, the choir's adult leader, was voiced by Jennifer Aniston, who in April 1999 was at the precise peak of her cultural visibility as one of the central cast members of Friends, which was completing its 5th season and remained the most watched program on American television. The casting of Aniston in a South Park episode was itself a piece of news, the kind of guest appearance that generated coverage before the episode aired and extended the conversation about the episode beyond the audience that would have watched it anyway. Her character embodied the specific kind of environmental activist Parker and Stone were examining, passionate about a place she had never been, committed to a cause she understood entirely through the mediation of other people's accounts and advocacy materials, and completely unprepared for the reality of what she had been defending with such unqualified enthusiasm. The boys are recruited into the choir against their will in the way that the show routinely drafted its young characters into situations adults had decided were good for them. They travel to Costa Rica as part of the choir's awareness-building mission. Once there, Cartman delivers the episode's central series of assessments of the environment he has been brought to appreciate. His descriptions of the rainforest as smelling like a specific anatomical region, his characterizations of the local infrastructure as full of prostitutes, shantytowns, and trash, his general register of complete contempt for the place and for the adults who had decided he needed to visit it, are the episode's most quotable content, and the content that eventually produced the formal governmental response from Costa Rica. They are also, as Parker confirmed in the DVD commentary, essentially autobiographical. The exaggeration is Cartman's. The underlying feeling of having been sold a destination that did not deliver on the expectations others had constructed around it belonged to the creator. The episode does not simply mock Costa Rica through Cartman's complaints, though those complaints are the most visible layer of what it is doing. The satirical structure is pointed at the human phenomenon of environmental advocacy, the way people who care about distant ecosystems construct a relationship with those places through the language of crisis and preservation without ever developing an actual relationship with the physical reality of the places they are defending. Miss Stevens' arc through the episode mirrors Parker's account of his own experience in reverse. She arrives committed to the beauty and importance of the rainforest. She encounters its actual physical character with all of Parker's disillusionment available for her to experience, and her transformation by the end of the episode involves a revised understanding of what she has been advocating for. The episode does not conclude that the rainforest is worthless or that conservation is pointless. It concludes that advocacy constructed entirely on idealized images of what is being protected produces a fragile kind of commitment, one that the encounter with reality is capable of collapsing in ways that more grounded knowledge might have survived. The president of Costa Rica appears in the episode briefly, depicted in a way that the show's Latin American distributors would eventually need to address. A native guide is killed and consumed by a coral snake within the first 10 minutes. The boys encounter rebels, enormous insects, and hostile indigenous people before the episode's resolution. All of this lands differently in an American context, where the show's extreme approach to everything it depicts provides a frame that its regular audience has developed fluency with. Then it lands in Costa Rica, where the episode's specific claims about the country are being evaluated by people with a direct stake in how that country is represented to an international audience that might use that representation to inform travel decisions. The episode aired in the United States in April 1999, was reviewed, generated the coverage that a prominent season premiere with a notable guest star produces, and then moved on through the natural cycle of South Park's weekly broadcast history. Latin American distribution of the show followed a timeline controlled by MTV Latin America's acquisition and scheduling decisions rather than by Comedy Central's American broadcast calendar, which meant the episode arrived in Latin American markets at a later point and through different channels than the ones that had carried it to the American audience. After it reached Latin American distribution, the episode continued to circulate for years without generating any formal governmental response from Costa Rica. The entire period between the episode's American premiere in April 1999 and the first organized official reaction from Costa Rica runs to approximately 8 years, which is long enough to raise the obvious question of what changed between those 2 points to make the episode's content a matter of formal governmental concern in 2007 when it had not been one in 1999. The answer is connected to the specific trajectory trajectory of what ecotourism had become to Costa Rica's economy and national identity between those two dates. The model that had been described as the poster child of ecotourism in the late 1990s had by 2007 become the foundation of something considerably larger. Tourism receipts had continued growing. The infrastructure built around bringing visitors safely through the country's protected areas had expanded and matured. The international recognition of Costa Rica as a conservation success story had deepened into something that functioned as a significant part of how the country was understood by the parts of the world it most needed to see it favorably. The gap between what Cartman had said about the rainforest in 1999 and what the rainforest represented economically and reputationally to Costa Rica by 2007 was considerably wider than it had been when the episode first aired. Not because the episode had changed, but because the stakes attached to how Costa Rica was portrayed internationally had grown. Carlos Benavidez was serving as Costa Rica's Minister of Tourism when the episode came to his formal attention in February 2007. His public response was not a carefully calibrated diplomatic statement. He said the show should be regarded as the trash it was, a program of that nature on a network designed for people with a lowly upbringing and bad customs. The language was contemptuous rather than analytical, treating the show as something beneath engagement rather than as a piece of satire worth the effort of examining for what it was actually saying. There was no acknowledgement in the tourism minister's statement that the episode had a primary satirical target that was not Costa Rica, that Cartman was a character whose opinions were deployed as tools of irony rather than as authorial positions, or that the show's depiction of the country was rooted in one creator's authentic personal experience rather than in a fabricated campaign against Costa Rican tourism. The statement addressed what the content felt like from the outside rather than what the content was designed to do from the inside. Environmental and conservation organizations with active interests in Costa Rica added a different kind of objection that sat alongside the tourism minister's dismissal. Their concern was functional rather than primarily personal. The episode's conclusion that the rainforest was not worth the effort of visiting or saving, even filtered through the ironic distance of Cartman as a character, was the kind of content that an organization dependent on generating public enthusiasm for conservation causes would prefer not to have in wide circulation. The specific argument that the rainforest smelled terrible and was full of snakes and uncomfortable things was, regardless of its satirical framing, the kind of counter-messaging that undermined the work of building a public that would support conservation financially and politically. The satirical framing might protect the episode's creators from the accusation that they were arguing against conservation in earnest, but it could not prevent the specific images and specific lines from entering the heads of young viewers who might retain Cartman's characterizations without retaining the ironic context that was supposed to contain them. South Park fans in Mexico organized protests outside MTV offices when the Pinewood Derby episode was pulled a few years later. The reaction to Rainforest Schmainforest among South Park's Latin American audience operated differently. The protests were over the episode's absence from the schedule, which came in 2011 when MTV Latin America stopped airing it, rather than over its content. Fans who had been watching South Park in Latin American distribution did not share the Costa Rican government's assessment of the episode as something too objectionable for broadcast. They understood it through the frame that South Park's regular audience applies to its content, a frame in which Cartman's extreme positions are the delivery mechanism for observations that are excessive in their expression and recognizable in their underlying feeling. The episode's Latin American fans were not watching it as a documentary about Costa Rica. They were watching it as a South Park episode that happened to be set in Costa Rica, a distinction that the people with the most direct stake in how Costa Rica was depicted did not find as meaningful as the fans did. MTV Latin America banned the episode from its schedule in 2011, roughly 12 years after the original American broadcast. The gap between the episode's first airing and the ban speaks to the slow pace at which Latin American distribution decisions, Costa Rican governmental objections, and the practical mechanics of cable television scheduling agreements move when they are operating in relation to each other across different institutional timelines. A ban that would have made obvious sense to impose in 1999 if the concern was genuine and the content was as problematic as it was eventually characterized, arrived 12 years later as the product of pressures that had built gradually through the intervening period rather than as a swift response to an acute offense. Studio Center, the dubbing company handling the show's Latin American Spanish localization, produced a revised version of the episode that addressed the specific content the Costa Rican government had found most objectionable. The version that emerged from this process toned down the dialogue in ways that allowed the episode to return to the broadcast rotation after the ban period. The original version, with Parker's authentic vacation sentiments channeled through Cartman's full register of contempt, remained the version available to audiences outside Latin America. Anyone in North America or Europe watching Rainforest Schmainforest through any available streaming platform is watching what Parker made, with every line Cartman delivers about the smell of the rainforest and the character of San Jose intact and unmodified. The version distributed through Latin American channels represents a negotiated compromise between the episode as conceived and the constraints of distributing it in the market it had offended. Flea has never publicly addressed the downstream consequences of recommending Costa Rica to his friend. The recommendation foundation that produced a bad vacation, that produced an episode, that produced a governmental response, that produced a 12-year ban, that produced a revised dubbing, that produced a version of the episode toned down enough for the market the original had offended, remains, as far as any available record shows, simply a piece of travel advice that went badly in one specific direction that its giver could not have anticipated. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Costa Rica's ban came from one creator's authentic reaction to a place he had visited personally. Japan's ban came from something entirely different, a corporate objection from one of the most powerful entertainment companies in the world, combined with a political sensitivity rooted in one of modern history's most contested national narratives. Section 7. Japan, Nintendo, an emperor, and a second attack on Pearl Harbor Pokémon launched in Japan in February 1996 as a pair of Game Boy cartridges built around a concept that Satoshi Tajiri had spent nearly a decade developing: small creatures with distinct characteristics, a system for catching and trading them, and a portable device that meant the game could travel with its player through the school day. The logic was structurally elegant in a way that is easier to recognize in retrospect than it was to predict in advance, and Nintendo, which published the games, did not initially treat the property as a guaranteed success. What happened instead was the kind of commercial result that production histories describe with the language of surprise: strong word of mouth, escalating sales, a trading card game that followed in October 1996, and an animated series that launched in April 1997 and became the most watched children's program in Japan almost immediately. By the time the franchise crossed into North American markets in late 1998, with all three components arriving simultaneously, the structure that would produce Pokémania had been assembled and tested. The American explosion that followed was large enough to put Pikachu on the cover of Time magazine in November 1999, and to generate a child safety recall over a Burger King promotional toy whose design had trapped a toddler's head in a manner its creators had not anticipated. For Nintendo, the franchise was not simply a successful product in the ordinary sense. Pokémon had become the thing that defined the company's global profile during a decade when Japan's broader economic confidence had been severely damaged by the collapse of the asset price bubble and the prolonged contraction that followed. A franchise conceived by a Japanese designer, published by a Japanese company, loved by children across the world in a way that required no translation of its essential appeal, carried a kind of national pride that went beyond the commercial value of the royalties it generated. Protecting how the franchise was depicted internationally was an institutional priority rather than a casual preference. South Park's Chin Pokémon episode aired in the United States on November 3, 1999, at the precise peak of the franchise's global visibility. The episode's premise replicated the Pokémon structure with enough fidelity to make the parody immediately legible. Collectible creatures with Japanese compound word names, a portable video game, an animated series featuring a child protagonist on a collection journey, and a merchandise ecosystem designed to make the franchise's absence from a child's life feel socially costly. Parker and Stone took this structure and excavated what they decided lay beneath it. What lay beneath it, in the episode's construction, was a Japanese military conspiracy to prepare American children for a second attack on Pearl Harbor. The Chin Pokémon camp that the boys attend, drawn there by the same compulsive engagement patterns that had filled real schoolyards with trading cards and arguments about rare creatures, is a military training facility. The children who arrive, already conditioned by the games and the animated series, are extended into something more. They speak only Japanese. They respond to military commands embedded in the franchise's language, and they are being prepared to pilot attack aircraft. The episode presents this without irony about its own extremity. The conspiracy is stated plainly, operated openly by Japanese executives who are completely confident in what they are doing, and discovered by adults who arrive too late and too distracted to stop it through any means other than the episode's eventual comic resolution. The running gag that provides the episode's funniest sustained material involves anatomy. The Japanese executives managing the Chin Pokémon operation have developed a single method for neutralizing every American adult who develops suspicion about what the franchise is doing to their children. They tell each adult male they encounter that Americans have enormous anatomical endowments compared to Japanese men, and that in the presence of such overwhelming superiority, there is nothing for a Japanese person to do but feel humbled. The compliment works every single time. Randy Marsh, Principal Victoria, and a series of other South Park adults arrive at the corporate headquarters prepared to demand answers about the military camp and leave having been told something wonderful about themselves. The flattery runs across multiple scenes, escalating in frequency as the episode moves toward its conclusion, and the joke's power comes from how completely it works. Adults who had developed genuine concern dissolve into satisfied complacency the moment the compliment is delivered. The corporate president running the Chin Pokémon operation is named Hirohito. Emperor Hirohito, formerly known in Japan as Emperor Showa, had died in 1989 after reigning since 1926. Using his name for a cartoon corporate villain presiding over a Pearl Harbor conspiracy was not a neutral creative choice in the Japanese cultural context, regardless of how naturally it landed within the absurd absurdist framework of the American show that had chosen it. The convention governing Japanese media's relationship with the imperial family has a name that translates approximately as the chrysanthemum taboo, derived from the chrysanthemum flower in the imperial crest. Before the Second World War ended, formal legal prohibitions against criticizing the emperor had been enforced as criminal matters. The post-war constitutional settlement removed those formal structures, but the social convention that had accumulated around them did not disappear when the law changed. A 1961 incident in which a right-wing activist attacked the publisher of a magazine that had printed fiction involving the imperial family reinforced for an entire generation of Japanese media professionals that approaching the emperor as a subject of creative work carried risks that the changed legal framework no longer formally described, but that real events confirmed were still present. Japanese broadcasters, publishers, and production companies absorbed this understanding and built their decisions around it, which is why depictions of the emperor in any fictional format remained vanishingly rare in Japanese media decades after the laws requiring that rarity had been repealed. A villain named Hirohito, running a Pearl Harbor conspiracy through a children's toy franchise, represented exactly the kind of content that organized right-wing groups in Japan monitored for and responded to. The networks that watched Japanese media for material they considered disrespectful to the imperial family or the national historical narrative were well established by 1999, and they had a track record of applying pressure to domestic media organizations that had produced content they objected to. A foreign production broadcasting through a Japanese cable network was a different situation from a domestic production, but the domestic broadcaster provided a domestic target for that pressure. The American producers who had made the episode were beyond reach. Wow Wow, the satellite cable network that had acquired South Park's Japanese broadcasting rights, was not. Wow Wow had launched its Japanese broadcast of the show in 1999, working through a domestic rights arrangement held by a company called Kuzui Enterprise. The arrangement gave Japanese audiences a dubbed version of the show, and Wow Wow had been working through the American catalog as seasons were completed and rights were cleared for the Japanese market. Two separate and distinct objections arrived around the Chin Pokemon episode: Nintendo of Japan's concern about how the episode was treating its franchise, and right-wing organizations' objection to the Hirohito name and the Pearl Harbor material. Nintendo's American subsidiary had not raised any formal complaint, and the show continued airing in Western markets without any legal action from the company's US operations. Japan was different. The franchise's home country was where its cultural significance was greatest, and where a parody framing it as a military brainwashing tool was most capable of producing institutional discomfort. The episode was removed from the Japanese dub entirely. It does not appear in the Wow Wow version of the third season and is absent from the Japanese DVD releases of that season. The removal happened within the existing distribution relationship between Wow Wow and Kuzui Enterprise, without any public statement from either party explaining what had been done or acknowledging the pressures that had produced the decision. The episode's absence from the catalog simply appeared, without the kind of public negotiation or press coverage that might have made the removal a story in its own right. Other episodes were also removed from the Japanese broadcast across the Wow Wow run. The two-part fourth season storyline, Do the Handicapped Go to Hell, and probably was cut because of its extensive references to Christian theology, a tradition practiced by a very small percentage of the Japanese population, and one that the episodes treated with the same irreverence the show applied to every religious subject. A Ladder to Heaven was removed for overlapping reasons. Crazy Cripples, in which Christopher Reeve appeared as a character depicted in extreme satirical terms, was pulled from the broadcast schedule following Reeve's death in October 2004. Woodland Critter Christmas and 2 Days Before the Day After Tomorrow completed the list of episodes that did not appear in the Wow Wow version, each removed without detailed public documentation of the specific reasoning behind the individual decisions. The Not Without My Anus episode, the gag installment that had aired in place of the South Park third season premiere in the United States, was also absent from the Japanese broadcast, either because of Saddam Hussein's appearance in that episode or because of the same general discomfort with the episode that had made it one of the more rarely rebroadcast installments in the show's American history as well. The Wow Wow arrangement ended when Kuzui Enterprise went bankrupt in 2005. The company holding the domestic rights ceased to exist, and the distribution relationship it had been maintaining ceased with it. South Park's 7th season, broadcast through October 2004, turned out to be the last the Japanese dubbed audience received through that channel. The ending was not an editorial decision about the show's suitability for the Japanese market. The business structure that had been supporting the broadcast simply collapsed, and the broadcast ended with it. Japanese fans who wanted to watch South Park through the gap years between the Kuzui bankruptcy and the streaming era's arrival were dependent on fan-subtitled versions circulated outside any official distribution agreement. A Fox satellite network in Japan carried a subtitled version of the show for a period, extending the available catalog beyond what Wow Wow's dubbed version had covered, but consistent official access remained limited. The complete American catalog, including every season produced after the 7th, remained inaccessible through any official Japanese channel for years following the bankruptcy. Netflix brought South Park to Japan in 2019 with a new Japanese language dub, representing the show's third distinct Japanese dub dubbing in its broadcast history. The new dub was produced independently of the decisions that had governed the WoW WoW version and of the specific removals that Kuzui Enterprises arrangement had produced across its 5-year run. The Netflix version gave Japanese audiences access to seasons of the show they had never been able to watch through any official domestic channel, and it did so through a distribution model that operated under a different regulatory framework than the broadcast environment where the original ban had been executed. The specific question of whether Chin Pokemon appears in the Netflix Japan catalog is one that available public documentation does not answer with complete clarity. What the historical record confirms clearly is that every previous Japanese distribution arrangement excluded the episode, that the exclusion was accomplished without public explanation, and that the two forces producing the exclusion operated simultaneously from different institutional positions with no coordination between them. Nintendo's concern was corporate, rooted in the company's interest in controlling how its most valuable franchise was depicted internationally. The right-wing group's concern was political, rooted in their ongoing project of protecting the imperial family and Japan's national historical narrative from foreign satirical treatment. The two concerns arrived at the same place. The episode should not air in Japan. The episode that generated this outcome was produced in Los Angeles on a schedule that gave its creators days rather than weeks to complete each installment, by two people whose cultural reference points were almost entirely American, and whose awareness of how specific creative choices would land in a country they were not making the show for was necessarily limited by the speed at which they were working. The gap between how a Pearl Harbor joke and a character named Hirohito registered within South Park's American satirical context, and how those same elements registered within the Japanese cultural environment they eventually reached, is the gap that produced the ban. Neither side of that gap was wrong about what it was experiencing. The show made what it made within the framework it was operating in. Japan responded to what arrived within the framework it was operating in. The distance between the two frameworks is the entire explanation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Japan's ban was driven by two distinct forces, operating simultaneously against the same episode. The next country on this list took a different approach entirely, not banning through institutional channels or corporate pressure, but through a sitting head of state, making his objections personal enough to pull an episode the night before it was scheduled to air. Section 8. Mexico. A flag law, a space whale, and a president who noticed Mexico's law on the national arms, flag, and anthem is a piece of legislation with roots going back to 1984 and a history of amendments that have progressively tightened the restrictions around how the country's national symbols can be used in commercial and broadcast contexts. The law governs the flag, the coat of arms, and the national anthem with a level of institutional seriousness that reflects a broader cultural relationship with national symbols that operates differently in Mexico than in most countries with similar democratic frameworks. The flag in particular carries a weight in Mexican public life that extends beyond its formal function as a national identifier and into the kind of daily ceremonial observance that is built into school schedules, civic events, and public ritual in ways that make contact with the symbol feel less like an interaction with a piece of cloth and more like an interaction with something the country treats as genuinely sacred in a secular sense. Monday morning flag ceremonies in Mexican schools are not optional, not performative, and not the kind of thing that adults in positions of authority approach with visible indifference. The flag is taken seriously, and the law protecting it is taken seriously, and the penalties for violating the law are real. Under Article 42 of the law's framework, broadcasting the Mexican flag on television without prior authorization from the relevant government body is prohibited. The authorization process requires submitting an application and receiving formal permission before the broadcast occurs. Proceeding without that permission exposes the broadcaster to a fine that, at the time of the relevant South Park incident in early 2010, was set at 52,590 pesos, equivalent to roughly $4,900 at the exchange rates operating that February. Paulina Rubio, one of Mexico's most commercially successful pop performers, had been fined 2 years earlier in 2008 when she appeared nude in the Spanish edition of a major international magazine using the flag as a covering prop. The fine and the coverage surrounding it had provided a recent and widely understood example of what the law's enforcement actually looked like when it was triggered, giving the flag authorization requirement a level of public visibility and institutional credibility that it might not have had if the Rubio situation had not occurred so close to the South Park incident. The episode at the center of the Mexican situation is Pinewood Derby, the 6th installment of South Park's 13th season, which had aired in the United States on April 15, 2009, and was scheduled to reach Mexican audiences through MTV Latin America's Mexican feed on the evening of February 8, 2010. The episode's premise involves Randy Marsh stealing a superconducting magnet from the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva to give Stan's handmade wooden car an illegal advantage in a youth racing competition. The car's speed with the stolen magnet installed exceeds everything anyone expected, achieves something in the range of warp speed, and the situation escalates until the planet Earth has made contact with an alien civilization, received a quantity of stolen interstellar currency from a space gangster, and found itself in a position where the world's political leaders must decide what to do with money that is not theirs observers and that the alien authorities are actively searching for. What the world's political leaders decide to do is keep the money and lie about it. The episode brings together a gathering of recognizable heads of government and depicts each of them responding to the sudden availability of vast sums of alien currency in ways that reflect their national stereotypes and personal vanities. Gordon Brown allocates funds in one direction. Silvio Berlusconi allocates funds in another. Vladimir Putin behaves with the authoritarian confidence the show's cartoon version of the Russian leader had established across previous appearances. Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel and representatives of various other governments all participate in the collective decision to deceive the alien police investigating the theft, and all are depicted as ultimately motivated by the same combination of self-interest and national pride that the episode treats as the universal operating system of political leadership, regardless of country or ideology. Nobody in the ensemble comes out of the episode looking particularly principled. Felipe Calderón's moment in the episode involves Randy Marsh, who has assigned himself the role of Earth spokesman in the alien negotiation, yelling at the Mexican president for spending his portion of the space cash on water parks. The specific charge is that Calderón's water park expenditure has raised the suspicion of the alien police, making the collective deception harder to maintain by creating visible evidence that the leaders have received money they should not have. The depiction is not specifically cruel to Calderón, beyond what the episode does to every other world leader in the same scene. Every leader makes a questionable choice with their allocation. Every leader prioritizes something that reflects some aspect of their public reputation or their country's assumed priorities. The joke applied to Calderón is not categorically different from the jokes applied to everyone else in the gathering. The reason the Calderón depiction had particular sensitivity in the Mexican context was connected to the specific political brand the president had spent his time in office building. Calderón had come into power in 2006, following an election so close that his opponent refused to concede, and the result was formally contested before the Federal Electoral Tribunal upheld Calderón's victory. The legitimacy questions surrounding his election made the early years of his presidency ones in which his public communications were especially focused on projecting competence and fiscal seriousness. He had adopted the description of himself as the employment president, a framing built around his administration's efforts to create jobs and manage the economy responsibly in the face of significant internal pressures, including the violence generated by his government's confrontational approach to the drug cartels that had intensified during his time in office. Appearing in an internationally distributed animated program as a leader who wastes an unexpected windfall on water parks was not the kind of imagery that fit the political brand his administration had been working to construct. MTV Mexico's decision to pull the episode from its February 8 schedule was announced through a statement from the network's spokesman, Eric Zermeno, who explained the situation in terms that made the flag permit the central and official reason for the cancellation. The permit required under the National Symbols Law had not arrived in time for the scheduled broadcast. The network had considered whether it could cover the Mexican flag visible in the scene, featuring Calderón, to proceed with the airing, and had concluded that altering the image in that way would have produced a worse reaction than simply not airing the episode at all. The fine for proceeding without the permit was the other element Zermeno referenced, providing the broadcast with a quantifiable legal risk that made the cancellation feel like a regulatory decision rather than a political one. The explanation's plausibility depended on accepting that the failure to obtain a broadcast permit for the Mexican flag in a specific South Park episode was a genuine administrative oversight rather than a convenient legal framework applied after the decision to cancel had already been made for different reasons. Outside observers looking at the situation found the permit explanation harder to accept at face value than an internal administrative failure would typically require. The episode had been airing in the United States for 9 months before it was scheduled to reach Mexico. MTV Latin America had presumably been aware of its contents during that period. The brief scene featuring Calderón in front of a Mexican flag was not buried in an episode that otherwise gave no indication of its content, and the network's content acquisition and scheduling teams would have reviewed the episode before placing it in the schedule. The suggestion that the flag permit question had not been addressed until the day before the scheduled broadcast required accepting a level of administrative inattention that the situation made difficult to credit. South Park fans in Mexico did not accept the permit explanation quietly. Reports from the period document fans organizing and gathering outside MTV offices in the days following the cancellation, expressing frustration with what they understood as a politically motivated decision dressed in regulatory language. The protest activity was not large enough to generate significant international press coverage, but it demonstrated that the episode's Mexican audience was reading the situation with the same skepticism that outside observers had brought to the network's official account. A broadcaster worried about a regulatory fine for an unauthorized flag display would have found covering the flag during the relevant scene a straightforward and inexpensive solution. The decision to cancel the entire broadcast rather than make a small visual alteration was the detail that made the permit explanation feel insufficient. The Houston Chronicle's coverage of the cancellation from February 2010 captured the bare facts with the kind of brevity that the story's official account invited. MTV had canceled the Mexico airing of an episode in which a caricature caricature of Calderón appeared in front of a Mexican flag, citing the need for government permission to show the episode inside Mexico because of a law stating the flag and other national symbols must be handled with respect. Zermeno's statement to media confirmed that the network had decided not to alter the image because the reaction would have been worse. Both statements were true on their surface, and both left intact the question that the surface did not answer. The Pinewood Derby situation had a predecessor in South Park's relationship with Mexican content that provides useful context for understanding how the country had arrived at this point in its relationship with the show. Free Wilsix, which had aired in the United States in November 2005, was built around a premise that took the boys through Tijuana to use a Mexican space program they had hired for $200 to launch what they believed was a space whale to the moon. The program was called MASA in the episode, constructed as an obvious parody of America's NASA, and its facilities as depicted in the episode reflected a combination of limited resources and ambitious aspiration that the show treated as both comic and somewhat endearing in its specificity. The whale was successfully launched. It died of asphyxiation on the lunar surface. The final credits ran in silence over a shot of the dead whale on the moon, which was the episode's most genuinely strange and affecting moment. The depiction of the Mexican space program as something that could be hired for $200 through a facility in Tijuana operated through the same logic as the Costa Rica episode's depiction of the rainforest, stereotype as the raw material for comic exaggeration, applied in a context where the show's regular American audience would read it through the ironic frame that the show's established voice provided. For Mexican audiences encountering the episode through the show's Latin American distribution, the frame was the same, but the proximity to the subject matter was different. A joke about Mexico operating a budget space program from Tijuana lands differently in Mexico than it lands in Colorado, not because the joke is more extreme in one place than the other, but because the distance between the joke's subject and the audience receiving it is different in ways that affect how the joke's exaggeration feels. Free Wilsix was banned in Mexico for the jokes it made at Mexican expense, a ban that was reportedly lifted around 2012 without any detailed public account of what had changed during the intervening period to make the episode acceptable for Mexican broadcast that it had not been during the original ban period. The Last of the Mohicans, which aired in the United States in October 2011 as the 9th episode of the 15th season, added another chapter to the Mexico relationship. The episode centers on Butters Stotch, who takes on an alter ego named Mantequilla and accidentally becomes a folk hero to Mexican laborers in the United States, inspiring a mass movement of people to return to Mexico that reverses the immigration flow the episode had been built around examining. Felipe Calderón appears in the episode with actual speaking dialogue. In a role that treats the situation as a political crisis, the Mexican government was actively managing and trying to bring under control. The episode was banned in Mexico for reasons that overlapped with the earlier cases, though it later appeared on DVD releases, suggesting its resolution through official distribution channels was handled differently from the broadcast restrictions that had applied to the earlier episodes. The accumulated pattern across Free Wilsix, Pinewood Derby, and The Last of the Mohicans tells a story about South Park's relationship with Mexican content that is distinct from the show's relationship with the content of every other country in this video. Each Mexican encounter with the show operated through a different mechanism, the space program jokes of Free Wilsix producing a content-based ban, the presidential depiction and flag law of Pinewood Derby producing a last-minute cancellation through a combination of regulatory and political pressure, the Calderón speaking role of The Last of the Mohicans producing a broadcast ban that was eventually resolved through physical media distribution. None of the three situations produced the same kind of resolution, and none of them were fully explained in their official accounts. What the Mexico story adds to the broader picture of countries that have banned or restricted South Park is a specific illustration of how different the same show can be in different contexts depending on how close the audience is to the material being depicted. Parker and Stone made episodes about Mexican space programs and Mexican presidents working from the same creative distance they applied to everything else the show addressed. The consequences of that creative distance, when the episodes crossed into the market most directly represented by their content, were real and measurable in ways that the American broadcast of the same episodes never produced. A sitting president noticed. A network canceled a broadcast the night before it was scheduled to air. Fans protested in the streets. The comedy that had been made in Los Angeles for a Comedy Central audience arrived at a border and became something considerably more complicated on the other side of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mexico's ban turned a simple episode about stolen alien money into a presidential diplomatic incident. The final country in this history used a different kind of power entirely, banning not an episode or a season, but the show's most ambitious film, and ensuring its most famous actor was eventually forced to watch it under circumstances neither he nor anyone who made it could have predicted. Section 9. Iraq, the ban that eventually caught up with its subject. Saddam Hussein arrived in the South Park universe in April 1998 through an episode that most of the show's American audience treated as a frustrating joke rather than a significant creative moment. Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anna Menace was the episode that aired on April 1st, 1998, in the slot, where the resolution to the Season 1 cliffhanger about Cartman's father had been promised, and it delivered instead a full-length installment built around the Canadian comedy duo that existed within the show's universe as a television program the boys watched. The audience that had been waiting for an answer to a specific narrative question received something else entirely, and the reaction was immediate and negative in ways that generated genuine coverage about viewer disappointment. Within the episode itself, though, a character arrived whose presence in the show's larger history would turn out to be considerably more significant than the frustrated response to his introduction suggested. Saddam Hussein appeared as the villain of the Terrence and Phillip story, depicted with a high-pitched voice, a body drawn in the show's standard animation style, topped with a photographic cutout of the real Hussein's face, and a catchphrase delivered with the breezy confidence of someone who had never once encountered a situation his authority could not resolve. The catchphrase, "Hey relax guy," delivered to every person who challenged him, established the character's fundamental quality in a single phrase: total self-assurance in the face of objections the character had no interest in taking seriously. Across subsequent appearances through the second and third seasons, the Saddam Hussein of South Park accumulated a consistent personality that deepened with each episode. He was vain, he was manipulative, he was genuinely convinced of his own superiority in a way that had curdled past arrogance into something more specific and more unpleasant, the settled certainty of a person who has received so much deference for so long that the idea of not receiving it has become literally inconceivable to him. He was also, crucially, funny in the way that South Park's best recurring characters were funny, which is to say, his specific combination of qualities produced situations that could be extended in multiple directions without exhausting the character's possibilities. By the time Parker and Stone were building the show's first theatrical film, they had a character they understood well enough to take somewhere new. Parker and Stone began developing the theatrical film in 1998, while continuing to produce the show's second season, working on both simultaneously, under a production schedule that did not offer much space for anything approaching leisure. The film's ambition was apparent from its early stages. It would be a musical, structurally borrowing from the conventions of the Hollywood animated musical that Disney had been dominating throughout the 1990s, and it would do so with South Park's full range of language and content intact rather than adjusted for the family audience that Disney's films were designed to serve. The combination of a genre associated with wholesome family entertainment and content that the show had established as deliberately extreme was itself the satirical premise the film was built around. A musical about free speech and censorship, made in a format associated with content carefully calibrated to offend nobody, was already making an argument before a single line of dialogue had been written. Production completed on a budget of $21 million, which was extremely lean for a theatrical animated film in 1999, and the film opened in the United States on June 30th of that year. The commercial result was immediate and significant: $83 million at the global box office against a $21 million production cost, a ratio that the studio had not necessarily been expecting from an adult animated film with an R rating and content that was keeping it out of every theater that might have attracted a family audience. The critical response ran alongside the commercial one with an unusual degree of alignment. Roger Ebert, whose opinion carried the most reliable authority of any single American film critic at the time, praised the film in terms that would have surprised anyone who had dismissed it as simply the cable cartoon in a movie theater, calling its political commentary the sharpest of the year and describing specific sequences with genuine enthusiasm. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated it for Best Original Song for the Blame Canada number, which meant the song was performed at the Academy Awards ceremony held in the spring of 2000, delivering a piece of South Park musical comedy to the most formal stage available in the American entertainment industry. Running through the film alongside its main storyline about four boys and a war between the United States and Canada is the Saddam Hussein plot, which placed the character in hell as Satan's romantic partner. Kenny arrives in hell early in the film after his customary death and finds the arrangement already established and already complicated. Satan is the sensitive partner in the relationship, the one seeking emotional connection and genuine intimacy, the one who wants the relationship to be something more than the physical terms Saddam has reduced it to. Hussein, for his part, is in the relationship for two things: sex and world domination, in that order, with no real distinction between how he pursues one and how he pursues the other. He is emotionally abusive to the ruler of hell in a way the film makes completely explicit, dominating through manipulation and contempt a figure who is, by every theological measure, more powerful than Saddam Hussein was in any earthly context. The joke was that Saddam Hussein was more evil than Satan, more controlling, more selfish, and more thoroughly immune to the feelings of the person he was in a relationship with. Matt Stone voiced the character, delivering lines with the same high-pitched, breezy confidence the character had established in his television appearances, now deployed in bedroom scenes that the film committed to with a level of detail that the R rating permitted, and that Parker and Stone appear to have treated as the natural extension of who the character was. The plot mechanism connecting the Saddam storyline to the main film involves a prophecy. If the Canadian comedians Terrence and Phillip are executed on Earth, the resulting chaos will enable Satan Satan and Saddam to escape hell and conquer the living world. As the United States and Canada move toward war over the two Canadians, Saddam's excitement grows, while Satan's discomfort with the relationship deepens. Kenny, working from inside hell, helps Satan recognize that the relationship is not serving him, and that Saddam's use of him as a vehicle for territorial ambition is not love. Satan throws Saddam off a cliff and back into hell, calls off the invasion of Earth, and the film's resolution arrives through the ruler of hell making a better romantic decision than he had been making for the film's entire runtime. The film was banned in Iraq on its release in 1999. Every available account of the ban identifies the same reason: the depiction of Saddam Hussein as a homosexual. The ban required no elaborate regulatory justification within the context of Iraq under Hussein's government. The country's leader had been depicted in a major Hollywood production in a way he and the people operating his government found objectionable, and the mechanism available to prevent Iraqi audiences from encountering that depiction was to prevent the film from entering the country. The ban was categorical and immediate, applied at the point of entry rather than after any period of public debate or regulatory deliberation. Kuwait also banned the film, extending the same prohibition that had already covered the television show into the film's theatrical distribution. Several other countries in the region declined to make the film available through official channels, though the specificity of Iraq's ban, covering a film that depicted the country's sitting head of state in the particular way this film depicted him, was qualitatively different from bans driven by general content standards. A film about censorship had been censored by the subject of one of its central storylines, which was an irony so complete that it barely needed pointing out. The film's primary satirical target was the American tendency to treat language and sexual content in entertainment as more dangerous than the institutional violence its public structures endorsed and produced. The Mothers Against Canada campaign driving the film's plot was a direct parody of organizations like the Parents Television Council that had been monitoring South Park's television content and applying pressure against it since the show's earliest seasons. Parker and Stone had made a film arguing against the suppression of creative expression, and the film had been suppressed by a government that found its creative expression objectionable. The argument had met exactly the kind of force it was built around critiquing, applied by a government whose own record on expression of any kind was not something any serious critic of censorship would have held up as a model. American forces captured Saddam Hussein on December 13, 2003, finding him in an underground bunker near his hometown of Tikrit after months of search operations that had followed the fall of his government earlier that year. He was placed in U.S. military custody and held at facilities including Camp Cropper near Baghdad International Airport during the period when he was being processed through the legal arrangements surrounding his trial before the Iraqi Special Tribunal. The 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army was among the military units involved in the operations surrounding his capture and his subsequent custody. At some point during his captivity, before his execution on December 30, 2006, the Marines responsible for guarding Hussein introduced him to the film that Iraq had banned 7 years earlier for depicting him in the specific way it had. The revelation of this fact came at the Edinburgh International Television Festival, where Matt Stone described what had happened in terms that made his own feelings about it entirely clear. Stone said he had it on pretty good information from the Marines on detail in Iraq that they had shown Hussein the movie, and that the experience of being made to watch this specific film repeatedly under these specific circumstances was really adding insult to injury. He said he bet that had made Hussein really happy, delivered with the tone of someone who found the entire situation genuinely satisfying in the way that outcomes connecting directly and specifically to the things that produce them tend to feel satisfying. Parker and Stone also received a tangible artifact from the situation. The U.S. Army's 4th Infantry Division sent them a signed photograph of Saddam Hussein, signed not by Hussein himself, but by the Marines who had been guarding him and who had organized the screenings of the film. Stone described the photograph as one of the biggest highlights of his and Parker's career, something they were very proud of in terms of what it represented. The photograph existed as physical evidence that the relationship between the film and its subject had continued past the moment the ban had tried to end it, in a direction that the ban's author had been powerless to prevent. Executed on December 30, 2006, at the age of 69, Hussein left behind a historical record whose enormity has nothing to do with South Park or with the film that bore his cartoon likeness. His government's documented atrocities, including the Anfal campaign against the Kurdish population and the massacre at Dhu Jail that formed the basis of his conviction and sentence, are the facts that define his place in history in any accounting that takes the historical record seriously. The South Park film and its aftermath represent something considerably smaller, a footnote whose specific shape is interesting, precisely because of how directly it connects the ban to its eventual consequence. A government banned a film for depicting its leader as a homosexual. The leader was removed from power, tried for crimes against humanity, and required to watch the film repeatedly by the people guarding him while he awaited execution. The film had been banned to protect the subject's dignity. The circumstances of the eventual screening were not designed with anyone's dignity in mind. Stone's account described the screenings as having occurred before the specific date of his Edinburgh revelation, which available records date to 2006. Whatever Hussein's actual experience of watching the film during his captivity consisted of, whether genuine distress, studied indifference, or something more difficult to categorize, it exists now only through Stone's second-hand account of what the Marines had reported. The signed photograph that Parker and Stone received is the documentary artifact of an event that no primary witness has described in detail. The film that depicted Hussein as the emotionally abusive gay boyfriend of the ruler of hell, banned by his government in 1999 to protect his image, was eventually screened for him in conditions that made the ban's original purpose feel remote and unreachable. The ban in Iraq dissolved with the government that had issued it, which made the ban's end not a reversal or a resolution, but simply an expiration. When the political structure that had decided the film should not enter Iraq ceased to exist, the reason for the ban ceased to exist with it. South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut was not rehabilitated in Iraq or formally permitted after a period of review. The government that had found it objectionable was no longer governing, and so the objection was no longer operational. The film sat in the catalog of South Park's history, available in every territory where it had not been banned, unchanged by everything that had happened to the person it had depicted in hell. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Iraq's ban lasted exactly as long as the government that issued it. Across every country in this history, each ban protected something different through a different mechanism and arrived at a different outcome, which turns the full map of bans into something more revealing than any individual case could be on its own. Section 10. South Korea, Russia, and the distance between a ban and a blur Tooniverse. Launched in South Korea in 1995 as a cable channel aimed at young audiences, building its programming around animated content and establishing itself across its first several years as the destination for children's animation in a market that had been underserved by domestic production and was consuming imported content at a rate that the channel's schedulers had to work hard to keep up with. By the late 1990s, Tooniverse had developed a clear identity and a clear audience, the kind of programming environment where parents made decisions about what their children could watch, partly based on the channel itself rather than the specific programs, trusting that a channel built around animation for children was operating within the parameters that implied. When South Park arrived in Tooniverse's schedule at some point in the late 1990s, the channel had made a decision that its audience had not been consulted about, and that the regulatory body overseeing South Korean broadcasting would find difficult to ignore once the complaints began arriving. The Republic of Korea Broadcasting Committee, which was the body responsible for overseeing broadcast content standards in South Korea at the time, received complaints from parents in volumes large enough to trigger an institutional response. The specific number of episodes that aired before the committee acted is recorded in available sources as 6, placing South Korea's ban as the fastest among every country that formally restricted the show. China's erasure happened within 5 days of a specific episode's broadcast, but that was a response from an Internet Infrastructure Authority to a targeted provocation. South Korea's ban arrived after 6 episodes of ordinary broadcast, before any particular installment had generated a specific controversy, and before any organized campaign from a religious institution, a political organization, or a corporate interest had formed around the content. The complaints were from parents who had found their children watching something that had been placed on a children's channel, and that was not, by any available measure, designed for children. The 6 episodes that aired before the ban came from the show's first season, which means the content generating complaints was not drawn from the episodes that would later become the show's most notorious installments. The first season of South Park contained language, cartoon violence, and situational humor that was aggressive compared to most of what was available on children's animated channels in any country in the late 1990s. But it was also the season before the show had developed the more precisely constructed satirical arguments that would define its most significant creative achievements. A child watching the first 6 episodes of South Park through the frame of a channel that had positioned itself as a children's animation destination was not encountering irony, political satire, or the kind of layered comedy that rewarded adult viewers who understood what was being pointed at. The child was encountering language, cartoon violence, and adult situations, delivered without the protective irony that the show's adult audience had developed fluency in applying to everything it showed. The Broadcasting Committee's response was categorical. The show was banned from Tooniverse's schedule. The decision did not come with the kind of specific content analysis that a ban based on a single episode's particular offense would have produced. It came from the accumulated weight of parental complaints about a general category of content, applied to a show that had been placed in a context that guaranteed the wrong audience would find it. The Tooniverse placement was the essential variable. The same show airing on a late-night cable channel with an adult content designation would have had a fundamentally different relationship with the Broadcasting Committee's standards, because the audience finding it would have been an adult one making an informed choice, rather than a child one whose parents had been relying on channel placement to make the choice for them. South Korean fans who wanted to watch the show after the ban spent years doing so through fan-subtitled versions that circulated outside any official distribution agreement. The situation was particularly stark because the ban had arrived so early in the show's South Korean broadcast history that there was no established licensed viewing experience to mourn. The show had been present in South Korea for 6 episodes episodes on the wrong channel before it disappeared from official availability. The fans who found it through fan subtitles were discovering it fresh, without any connection to the broadcast that had been cut short, building a relationship with the show through unofficial channels that the regulatory environment had pushed them toward by removing the official ones. Netflix's arrival in South Korea with Korean subtitled South Park content sometime before 2019 dissolved the practical effect of the Broadcasting Committee's ban without requiring any formal reversal of the decision itself. The ban on Tooniverse's broadcast remained, in the sense that no institution had formally reconsidered the original determination. What changed was the distribution infrastructure. A streaming service, operating under a different regulatory framework from the one that had produced the ban, made the content accessible to Korean subscribers, and the gap between what the old framework prohibited and what the new framework permitted was wide enough to accommodate the entire show's catalog without any institutional friction. The parents who had complained to the Broadcasting Committee in the late 1990s about what their children were watching on Tooniverse had produced a ban that streaming had rendered practically irrelevant within a decade. Russia's relationship with South Park across the same decades operated through a completely different mechanism and produced a completely different kind of outcome, one that raises questions the South Korean situation does not raise because it never resolved into the clean finality of a total ban followed by a streaming dissolution. The channel that broadcast South Park in Russia was 2x2, a television network that had been operating since 1989 and had developed a reputation for adult animated content that put it into intermittent conflict with Russian regulatory authorities throughout the 2000s and 2010s. South Park was one of the programs at the center of that conflict, generating formal government warnings that went considerably further than the kind of complaints that had triggered South Korea's Broadcasting Committee response. The Russian government issued two separate formal warnings to 2x2 over its programming, the specific content of which placed the channel in danger of losing its broadcasting license. The first warning cited promoting immorality and violence, a formulation that covered the general register of South Park's content without specifying any particular episode or sequence. The second warning was more specific in its language, citing overt propaganda of homosexuality and pedophilia, a characterization that reflected the Russian government's evolving legal framework around content involving sexual minorities, which had been tightening throughout the 2010s through legislation that gave regulatory authorities increasing ability to act against content they identified as promoting homosexual relationships to audiences in ways the law characterized as harmful. Two formal warnings brought 2x2 within the procedural territory, where a third violation could result in closure. The channel continued to broadcast South Park, but it was doing so in an environment where the regulatory pressure against specific categories of the show's content was real, documented, and capable of producing consequences that went beyond the content itself and into the survival of the channel airing it. The specific censorship that 2x2 applied to South Park's Pinewood Derby episode illuminates what operating under that kind of pressure looks like in practice. The episode depicts a gathering of world leaders responding to the arrival of stolen alien currency, and among those leaders is a recognizable cartoon version of Vladimir Putin. Putin's version of the episode's central behavior, the greedy and desperate response to the sudden availability of enormous wealth that the episode applied to every world leader equally, was cut from the Russian broadcast of that installment. The segment depicting Putin in those terms simply was not in the version of the episode that Russian audiences saw, removed within the existing broadcast relationship between 2x2 and the show's distribution without any formal announcement about what had been done or why. The cut was narrow and surgical, touching only the seconds of footage that placed the Russian president in an unflattering equivalence with every other world leader in the same scene, leaving the surrounding episode intact. The marijuana-related censorship that arrived with season 23 operated through a different channel and a different kind of institution. Kinopoisk, a Russian streaming service, was carrying South Park content when the Tigridy Farms storyline introduced marijuana cultivation as a central element of the show's ongoing narrative. In the episode Let Them Eat Goo, the Tigridy Farms logo appeared on screen with a marijuana leaf as part of its design. Kinopoisk blurred the marijuana leaf in the logo throughout the episode, a visual alteration that left the rest of the content unchanged and that a representative of the service attributed to a decision of the copyright holder rather than of the streaming platform itself. The Christmas Snow episode, which was the season 23 finale and which also contained marijuana-related content, was not released in Russia at all through the streaming service, extending the pattern of marijuana-related restriction into an outright non-release for a specific installment. The contrast between what Russia produced and what South Korea produced across the same general decades of the show's international distribution is the most instructive comparison available in the show's global censorship history. South Korea's ban was total, categorical, and arrived fast, triggered by a channel placement error that put the wrong content in front of the wrong audience through a regulatory system that responded to the resulting complaints with a clean institutional decision. The ban was then dissolved by a change in distribution technology that made the regulatory decision's practical effect irrelevant. South Korea's relationship with the show moved from availability to complete prohibition to de facto availability again, in a sequence that was driven more by the infrastructure of distribution than by any shift in the regulatory body's view of what the show contained. Russia's relationship with the show moved in a different direction, producing not a ban but an ongoing negotiation between what the show's content included and what the Russian regulatory environment would permit to reach audiences through licensed channels. The two formal warnings to 2x2 did not produce a ban on the show. They produced a broadcaster operating under documented governmental pressure, making content decisions within that pressure, cutting specific segments, allowing other content to proceed, and surviving the regulatory scrutiny by staying close enough to the acceptable edge to avoid the third warning that might have triggered closure. The Kinopoisk marijuana blur and the Christmas Snow non-release extended this negotiation into the streaming era through a different platform with a different ownership structure, producing content alterations that were attributed to copyright holders rather than regulatory bodies, but that existed within the same general landscape of pressure that had produced the 2x2 warnings years earlier. What these two cases together reveal about the range of outcomes that governments produce when they encounter content they find threatening is something that neither case makes visible on its own. A total ban is the clearest possible statement a regulatory environment can make about content. This is incompatible with what this place permits, and it will not be present here. The statement is categorical in a way that invites a categorical response. Either the ban holds or it dissolves. Either the content is available or it is not. South Korea's ban held until streaming dissolved it, and the sequence has a beginning and an end that can be described cleanly. Incremental censorship produces no such clean narrative. Russia's ongoing negotiation between the show's content and what its regulatory environment permitted created a version of South Park that existed specifically in the space between what the creators had made and what the authorities would allow to reach audiences. That space was not stable. It shifted with the government's evolving legislative priorities around sexual minorities, marijuana, and the depiction of political figures, and each shift produced a new set of content decisions by the channels and services carrying the show. The version of South Park that Russian audiences received through licensed channels was not the same show that American audiences watched on Comedy Central or that Korean audiences eventually found on Netflix. It was a version shaped by a decade of regulatory pressure applied to a broadcaster that had survived two formal warnings and was making content decisions accordingly. The most precise statement about what any government finds genuinely threatening in a piece of content is often not the total ban, which can be triggered by general incompatibility as easily as by specific fear, but the incremental cut, the segment removed, the logo blurred, the episode withheld from release, while the surrounding season proceeds normally. A government that cuts the 14 seconds of a Pinewood Derby segment depicting its leader as greedy and desperate is telling you exactly what it considers too dangerous to reach its audiences, in a way that a total ban on the show's general vulgarity does not. The specificity of the cut is the specificity of the fear. South Korea banned South Park because a children's channel aired it for 6 episodes, and parents complained. The ban was total, immediate, and eventually dissolved by technology. Russia never banned the show, but spent years shaping what version of it its audiences were allowed to see, cutting political content, blurring drug imagery, withholding specific episodes, and leaving everything else to broadcast normally. Between those two positions, and between all the positions occupied by every other country that has restricted the show in ways large and small, lies the full range of what governments do when they encounter content that threatens something they have decided is worth protecting. The show that produced all of this was made by 2 people in Los Angeles, working on a schedule that gave them days to finish each episode. The governments that responded to it had the full weight of their institutional structures available, and still, in most cases, the show is still there. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.